Lisa, with tear-filled eyes, gently stroked her still flat stomach as she said, "I'm pregnant with John's child, so Karen should divorce him. It's too sad for a child to grow up without a father, don't you think?" Her words were directed at me while Elisa's parents glared in my direction. As John's childhood friend and ex-girlfriend, Lisa had surprised me many times before, but this time I was truly and deeply disheartened. "You see, my name is Karen, and I had a happy marriage with John. I speak of it in the past tense because John is no longer with us. He left the house one morning with a smile, saying, 'I'm off,' but tragically, he never returned the same. John had passed away suddenly from an illness, leaving me heartbroken. Before John's untimely death, we had just begun to settle into a peaceful married life. However, our relationship had been complicated by John's overbearing mother and Lisa, his persistent ex-girlfriend. Since John's passing, I've had little contact with my mother-in-law, who was always selfish and controlling, determined to direct John's life as she pleased. For many years, John's mother saw Lisa as the ideal match for her son, almost like a daughter-in-law chosen by both sets of parents. In fact, they were led to believe they were a couple as children and even thought they were romantically involved until middle school. But when John reached his teenage years, he realized the absurdity of the arrangement. He gently explained to Lisa that their supposed engagement was not normal, and though he moved on, Lisa never did. John was handsome and smart, though admittedly not athletic, which oddly enough made him even more attractive. After breaking up with Lisa, he had other girlfriends, but she refused to let go. Whenever John dated someone new, Lisa would appear during their dates, recounting their childhood memories together. No girlfriend would feel comfortable hearing stories of their first kiss in kindergarten or how their parents had essentially planned their engagement. As a result, many of John's relationships ended because of Lisa's interference, or so I'd heard. By the time I met John, we were both working adults, and I, too, became a target of Lisa's antics. Although her behavior was bothersome, I had no intention of breaking up with John. He truly cherished me, and I felt the same way about him. Our relationship was built on love and mutual respect, and I believed Lisa had no place in it. When John once apologized for Lisa's behavior, looking regretful, I told him, "Don't worry about it, let's get some ice cream. I'm hungry." He was so relieved, and later, he told me that was the moment he knew he wanted to marry me. We eventually decided to get married, but my mother-in-law and Lisa teamed up to try and stop us. Lisa came from a wealthy family, and it seemed that my mother-in-law had hoped John would marry her to benefit financially. Since Lisa was eager to marry John, their goals aligned perfectly. When I would visit my in-laws to pay my respects, I faced constant harassment. Once, despite knowing in advance that I would be visiting, my mother-in-law invited Lisa over for a tea party. My father-in-law tried to intervene, telling my mother-in-law that enough was enough, but she was far too domineering for him to make any real impact. Whenever he tried to object, she'd brush him off, saying, "Lisa is like a daughter to us, it's fine." Defeated, he would fall silent. Lisa was familiar with all of John's previous girlfriends, so she took particular pleasure in mocking me, positioning me as the least attractive. She would say things like, "John didn't marry for looks but for personality, but I can't believe Karen's such an amazing person." Her sarcastic remark made my mother-in-law laugh, and it created even more tension. John, however, was furious. He confronted both his mother and Lisa, yelling, "Don't ever get involved with Karen again." Then he took me away from his family's house. He apologized repeatedly and went so far as to refuse to invite his mother to our wedding. Naturally, Lisa wasn't invited either, which infuriated both of them. In retaliation, my mother-in-law and Lisa decided to visit our new home when John wasn't around. John had already told me that I didn't need to interact with them, so when I saw them on the security camera, I asked them to leave, but they refused, ringing the doorbell and making a scene. To avoid drawing attention from the neighbors, I reluctantly opened the door. They barged in, immediately criticizing the interior of our home. Lisa called the indirect lighting, which John had carefully chosen, tacky, but when I mentioned that John had selected it, she quickly changed her tone, saying, "That's so John, I actually think it's a nice design," making her insincerity all the more obvious. Despite them arriving uninvited, I served snacks and tea because they complained of being hungry. My mother-in-law scolded me for not offering homemade treats, and Lisa griped that the tea was bitter. After they had their fill of complaining, they left just before John returned home. Exhausted, I fell asleep on the sofa, and when I woke up, I found that John had gently covered me with a blanket. I told him everything that had happened, and he was livid. He immediately called both his family and Lisa to confront them, but his family showed no signs of regret, and Lisa, far from feeling chastised, was delighted to hear from John after such a long time. I realized that no matter what we said to my mother-in-law or Lisa, it wouldn't make a difference. After talking it over with John, we decided that if they showed up again, we wouldn't open the door and would call the police if they caused a scene. If they still refused to leave, we planned to seek further help from the authorities. It was really difficult when my mother-in-law and Lisa did show up, and we had to call the police. However, after being scolded by the officers, they finally stopped coming to our house. Though it was tough, I thought we could finally live in peace. But then, out of nowhere, John passed away suddenly. At the funeral, I was in shock, clinging to the coffin and crying. My mother-in-law cruelly blamed me, saying that I had stressed John out, leading to his death. If my parents hadn't stood up for me, I don't know how I would have made it through. I expected Lisa to attend the funeral, but she didn't. Even now, I shudder to think what might have happened if she had teamed up with my mother-in-law to accuse me. 3 years have passed since John's death, and I still live in the house we shared. Though it's painful, I can't bring myself to leave the place filled with memories of him. One day, as I was enjoying a quiet moment, the doorbell rang. I checked the monitor and saw Lisa, along with 2 people who looked like her parents. Lisa was smiling, but her parents wore serious expressions. Curious, I decided to let them in since John's death anniversary was approaching. I opened the door, not realizing it was a mistake. "Long time no see, Karen," Lisa said. "I'm pregnant with John's child, so you need to divorce him. It's not right for a child to grow up without a father, don't you think?" She caressed her flat stomach, her eyes filling with tears. I was shocked. I had been caught off guard by Lisa before, but this time I was completely speechless. John had passed away, and yet she was saying this? As I tried to make sense of her words, her parents stepped forward, raising their voices. "Even though John was married, he got Lisa pregnant. He needs to take responsibility," they shouted. "You can't expect Lisa to raise this child alone." As the 3 of them made a scene at my door, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Even after John's death, Lisa continued to torment him. John had always been kind, but Lisa caused him so much stress during his life. I couldn't forgive her. With that thought, I invited them inside, saying it wasn't good to keep standing at the entrance. I led them into the living room, where our family portraits were displayed. Lisa's parents entered first and were shocked when they saw the portraits. Lisa followed, her eyes widening and her voice catching in her throat when she spotted John's picture. While they were still processing what they saw, I calmly unfolded a table, served tea, and sat down. "So, Lisa, you're pregnant with John's child, huh? John passed away 3 years ago. I'd love to know how you managed to get pregnant with my late husband's child," I said, pretending to be concerned. "Are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." Lisa's face turned white, her voice trembling as she muttered, That can't be true." But before she could react further, her parents stepped in. Her father immediately knelt down in apology, followed by her mother. He grabbed Lisa's arm, forcing her to bow as well. "We're so sorry," her father said. "We didn't know John had passed away." As Lisa broke into tears, her father grabbed her by the collar and shouted, "Who's the father of the child you're carrying?" That's when Lisa started to confess her wrongdoings. The reason Lisa had stopped coming to our house wasn't because she had given up, but because she had been transferred for work. It turned out that neither Lisa's nor John's parents had been in contact, so they truly didn't know John had passed away. As for the baby Lisa claimed to be carrying, it was unclear who the father was. It could have been her married boss or one of the men she met at bars. Lisa had been living such a chaotic life that it was impossible to determine who the father was. Even though she had feelings for John, she had tried to tear us apart by lying and saying the child was his, thinking John wouldn't abandon her now that she was going to be a single mother. Upon hearing Lisa's confession, her mother started crying, and her father called her behavior shameful. I calmly asked Lisa, "How many months pregnant are you?" 3 months. The baby is already kicking," she stammered. "You usually don't feel the baby move until at least 4 months. Are you sure there's really a baby?" I asked, giving her a cold stare. Lisa trembled and eventually admitted, "There's no baby. I love John. I really do." As she rambled on, her mother began smacking her on the back, and her father, now in tears, deeply bowed to me and said, "We will come back another day to apologize." Then they left. As they departed, I told them, "No need for further apologies, just don't come back again." After they hurried away, I lit a candle at the home altar and prayed. I spoke to John, thanking him for giving me strength. Normally, I'm not one to argue or stand my ground, but somehow I managed to handle the situation calmly, just like John would have. He was always good at keeping his cool during conflicts. It felt like John was with me that day, guiding me. I cried for the first time in a long while, realizing just how much I missed him. The house felt unbearably empty without him. A few days later, despite my request for them not to return, Lisa's parents came back. I didn't want them in the house full of memories of John, so I agreed to meet them at a nearby restaurant. After paying my respects to John at the altar, I went to the restaurant. Lisa's parents were waiting for me, looking pale. "We deeply apologize for our rudeness the other day. We are truly ashamed of our daughter," Lisa's father began. Apparently, after hearing about John's death, Lisa had a breakdown, crying uncontrollably. In her delusion, she somehow convinced herself that I was responsible for John's death and wanted to confront me. Her parents, thankfully, took her to a hospital instead. Lisa was diagnosed with a severe mental illness, which caused her to hurt others to get what she wanted. She would be undergoing therapy and counseling moving forward. Lisa had quit her job, believing she was going to marry John, and now would have to face the reality of her situation while receiving treatment. Her parents, despite their wealth, seemed quite old and worried about taking care of her. They handed me an envelope of cash as an apology for the trouble. I didn't even bother to open it. "I don't need this money. All I want is to never deal with you or Lisa again. Maybe you could use it to move somewhere far away so we don't cross paths," I replied with a bit of sarcasm. They solemnly agreed, saying they would move. Later, I received a letter confirming they had relocated far away, along with more money, which I rejected again. Looking at their new address, it seemed they had moved quite far. Now, I knew Lisa would never be part of my life again. Speaking to John's photo on the anniversary of his death, I said, "Our marriage faced many challenges, but I cherished every moment with you. My life with you was a happy one. Thank you. From now on, I plan to live my life alone, cherishing the joys John never got to experience, and when I eventually join him in heaven, I'll have plenty to tell him about."
It was early morning, and the taxi park's garage buzzed with activity. Amanda, a young cab driver, had been working under her car's hood for half an hour, unaware of her surroundings. Suddenly a deep voice interrupted her concentration. "Hello, Amanda. It's early morning and you're already tinkering with your car. What's wrong? Do you need help?" The girl broke away from her work, stood up and wiped the sweat off her forehead. She looked comical, with smudged engine oil on her nose, holding a dirty rag and wrench instead of a manicure tool. "Hello, Barry. I've got it under control, thanks. There was an issue with the ignition, but I replaced the plugs and now it starts perfectly. Let me wash my hands and we can have some coffee. I haven't even had breakfast yet and I'm starving. Take out the cabbage pies I baked last night. Help yourself." Barry eagerly rubbed his hands together and savoured the treats. "Oh, Amanda, you're wonderful. These pies are delicious. You can fix cars, bake pies, and you're beautiful. What a pity I'm married. And your fiancé is a fool. A smart girl like you should be cherished and protected." Amanda let out a heavy sigh, sat down beside him, took a sip of scalding aromatic coffee, and replied, "Don't be offended, but men, they're all the same. They love you at first, then they disappear into thin air. Well, I don't need anyone. I'll save up money, have a child, and raise him on my own. Just don't tell Mr. Farris that I'm pregnant. That money-hungry jerk will kick me out." Before Amanda could finish her meal, the radio beeped, and the dispatcher informed her that she had to drive for a client. She shook hands with her colleague and drove off, humming a simple tune to herself. In reality, Amanda enjoyed working as a cab driver very much. The day was never boring, with interactions with different people and the opportunity to learn the latest news and interesting stories. However, there were occasional mishaps. If someone had told her 3 months ago that she would be working as a cab driver, she probably wouldn't have believed it. Amanda's childhood was spent in the countryside. Her mother passed away when she was only 5 years old due to a severe kidney disease, and she never knew her father. Her grandfather took on the responsibility of raising her to prevent her ending up in an orphanage. He couldn't bear the thought of his granddaughter being alone. Amanda loved her life in the countryside, surrounded by endless wheat fields, open spaces, fragrant hay, and her favourite cat. Her grandfather adored her and taught her everything he knew, from mowing grass to driving and repairing their old Chevrolet. Together they rebuilt the entire car. By the time Amanda turned 16, she could drive as well as any experienced person. She passed her driver's license exam on her first try. Then she decided to move to the city. Amanda realised that there were limited prospects in the village, as young people were leaving only the elderly residents behind. Her grandfather gave her his small savings, blessed her and wished her well. Amanda rented a room and found a job as a waitress in a small cafe. She didn't particularly enjoy the job, as she was on her feet all day and her back would ache by the end of her shift. However, she needed to make a living somehow. Every day, during her lunch break at the cafe, a young and handsome guy would visit. He always ordered coffee, sandwiches and snacks, taking his time to enjoy them. He couldn't take his eyes off Amanda. The feeling was mutual, and she would feel a bit shy every time she served him. That's how they got to know each other. The guy's name was Stephen, and he worked as a manager in a nearby tour company. He lived with his parents, who worked as clerks in a bank. They were an ordinary family. Stephen showered Amanda with compliments, flirted with her, and one day he brought her a beautiful bouquet of delicate pink daisies, saying, "Daisies for my Amanda. You are as beautiful as these flowers. I think about you all the time. I would like to invite you to the movies. I already got 2 tickets for the premiere. Would you like to come?" Amanda agreed with pleasure, her heart racing with excitement, and so the couple began to date. Stephen met Amanda in the evenings after his shift, saw her home, and one day decided to stay for good. The girl was ecstatically happy and hoped that they would soon get married, as Stephen had hinted at several times. But everything changed one day when Amanda discovered she was pregnant. She took a test and became a little scared. She and Stephen had not discussed children yet, and there was no wedding planned. She decided to tell Stephen everything in the evening and see how he reacted. Stephen remained silent for a long time and had a frown on his face, clearly displeased with the news. Amanda felt hurt and asked, "Honey, aren't you happy? It's our baby, yours and mine. We should hurry and get married before the belly is visible." "I suppose so," Stephen mumbled incoherently. "It's just too early. I thought you were using protection." "Well, I'll talk to my parents and tell them everything." But after this conversation, Stephen disappeared. He didn't answer the phone and didn't show up for their lunch at the cafe. Amanda was exhausted and cried her eyes out, unable to understand what had happened. Why was Stephen behaving like this? Did he have a change of heart? Then someone told Amanda something that shattered her. "Amanda, don't get upset, but I saw your Stephen yesterday at the mall. He was walking arm in arm with some other woman, whispering sweet nothing. When he saw me, he turned away as if he didn't know me. I could be mistaken, but I think it's clear. Your Stephen has found someone else." Amanda cried uncontrollably, unable to believe it. How could it be? How could he? Maybe it's a mistake. What if she's a relative of his? I have to find out. Otherwise I'll go crazy. Amanda excused herself from work and waited for Stephen outside his office. She waited for 2 hours. Finally, he came out. But he wasn't alone. He was with apparently the same woman from the mall. They got in a fancy car and started passionately kissing. Amanda's heart sank, and she felt deeply offended. Losing control, she ran towards the car, banging on the glass and shouting, "Cheater! Traitor! What about me? Aren't you ashamed, you scoundrel?" Frightened, Stephen jumped out, pushed Amanda away and murmured, "Forgive me, it just happened. Peggy is now my fiancée. My parents decided it. I told them everything and they forbade me from seeing you. Please go away, Amanda. It's over between us." Stunned, Amanda slapped Stephen hard and said, "But I'm pregnant with your child. What am I supposed to do now? Don't you care?" Stephen shrugged and said, "Well, I don't know. Go to the hospital and solve the problem. What's the big deal? Amanda, please stop screaming and go away." Then a wealthy woman emerged from the salon, giving Amanda a scornful look, and asked, "Who is this, Stephen? What does this crazy woman want from you?" Stephen pushed Amanda away and replied, "It's nothing. She's just mistaken." Peggy approached Amanda, looked her in the eyes, and said harshly, "This, sweetie, is mine. I've decided it, and you better not get in my way. Otherwise you'll be in trouble. My father has connections. I've warned you." Stephen and Peggy drove away, dousing Amanda from head to toe with water from the puddle. But the poor girl was standing in the middle of the parking lot, unable to move. It all felt like a nightmare, a terrible dream. Amanda couldn't bring herself to go to work. She cried at home for a week, consumed by grief and betrayal. There were even thoughts of going to the hospital to solve all her problems at once. But she was scared. What if something went wrong and she couldn't have children at all? How could she live with the guilt of ending a life? On one of those dark days, her neighbour Barry came to visit, asking for a stomach pill for his sick child. He forcefully took her to his home, where his wife joined them. They gave Amanda sedatives, hot tea, and patiently listened to her story. The girl needed someone to talk to pour out her soul, because the pain of her lover's betrayal was tearing her heart apart. She told everything without holding back any secrets. Barry listened, shook his head, remained silent, and then quietly asked, "Well, what a mess. Your Stephen is a jerk. What can I say? What are you going to do?" Amanda shrugged her shoulders and replied, "I missed a week at the cafe, so I was obviously kicked out. I'll have to go back home to the village, to my grandfather, but I don't know how I'll face him. Shame on me, and I don't know how I'm going to make a living." Barry scratched the back of his head and said, "No, going back to the village is not a solution. What will you do there? Milk cows? Listen, you mentioned that you have a driver's license and drive well. Come and work at our taxi company. We're short of drivers. But our boss, Mr. Farris, is very watchful, so you'll need to be diligent. However, you'll earn a good monthly salary if you're not lazy. You can save up money for labour and the baby, and then go on maternity leave. Just keep your pregnancy quiet, because if Mr. Farris finds out, he won't take you." Amanda wiped her tears and looked at her neighbour with gratitude. "Thank you, Barry. This is my dream job. I've loved speed and roads since childhood, and I'm a skilled driver. Don't doubt it. I'll start a new life. I've had enough of that cafe. Well, I'll come back tomorrow then, okay? Thank you, guys. I need to hurry and clean myself up. I look like a mess, swollen from crying." Barry's wife patted Amanda on the shoulders and said, "Good girl, Amanda. You can't give up. Why should you let this jerk ruin your life? When you give birth to your little one, you'll realise that his happiness is the most important thing to you. Everything will work out, and we'll help you. Don't worry." And so Amanda found herself working at the taxi company. At first, Mr. Farris didn't believe that she would succeed. He questioned how she would handle heavy client luggage and fix the car if something went wrong on the road. But then he saw how confidently Amanda drove and how she could handle car malfunctions on her own. She performed her duties well, so he decided to hire her. The girl perked up and cheered up. Now she had no time to dwell on her pain and cry. The whole day flew by as she drove and interacted with clients. She enjoyed the work, and Amanda ran to it with joy. Her belly wasn't visible yet, and she wore loose sports hoodies and sweatshirts, so she could continue working almost until her maternity leave. Luckily, her health didn't let her down, and she didn't suffer much from morning sickness. Occasionally her back would ache from sitting for long periods, but it was still better than carrying trays. The only thing that bothered Amanda was the intrusive and greedy owner. At the end of each shift, he demanded a minute-by-minute report. He even installed cameras in the cabin to monitor how the drivers interacted with customers and to ensure money wasn't being mishandled. Despite this, the team was excellent, and Amanda found that it was easier to work with men. There was no gossip or drama. Everyone was focused on their work. She remained friends with Barry, and they would drink tea from a thermos and talk about life. Today, Amanda had a lucrative order. She needed to drive far out of the city to pick up a client. The client promised to pay well just to be back in the city, so the earnings were expected to be good due to the long distance. Amanda was in a great mood, humming a song as she drove towards the client. She was already planning where she would place the crib and where to buy an affordable stroller. She calculated how much she needed for all these preparations. She tried not to dwell on the treacherous Stephen, although it was difficult. Sometimes tears would well up in her throat. However, she focused on her future and the upcoming arrival of her baby. Upon arriving at the requested location, Amanda's mood quickly faded. She found herself in a huge country mansion where a wild party was taking place. The client was extremely drunk and kept changing his mind about getting into the cab. 10 minutes later, the homeowner cancelled the call. The girl felt upset because she had wasted gas and time without earning any income. She knew that Mr. Farris would scold her for this, but it wasn't her fault. Besides, the weather worsened with heavy rain pouring down from the frowning sky, further dampening Amanda's mood. She was halfway to town when suddenly a tramp emerged from the woods. He staggered from side to side, covered in mud and dried blood. The girl couldn't just pass him by, so she slowed down. She decided that if he was drunk, she wouldn't pick him up, but she wanted to see what was wrong with him. The girl put on her hooded jacket and jumped out of the car. She ran up to the man and took a closer look. "Hey, are you sick? May I help you? Where are you going? If you're headed to the city, I can give you a ride." The man looked at her with cloudy eyes and whispered weakly, "Help me." And after that, he lost his consciousness and fell by the roadside. He didn't smell of alcohol, that was for sure. Amanda slapped his cheeks, pleading, "Wake up! I can't get you to the car alone. Come on! Let's go up carefully." After much effort, the girl managed to get the wretched man into the car and drove him to the hospital. Along the way, she tried to find out more about him, but he only said that his name was Mitchell and moaned in pain. Amanda handed her passenger over to the medical staff, ensuring he was properly cared for. As she bid him goodbye, she said, "Well, I helped as much as I could. Get well. All the best to you." The girl hurried back to the taxi park, realizing that she had been delayed and worried that Mr. Farris would be angry. She had forgotten about the camera in the salon, but her boss was sitting in his office, watching all her movements. He was furious and reprimanded her as soon as she arrived. "What do you think you're doing? You refused to drive the client, wasted my gasoline, and spent half a day driving around homeless people. I lost so much money because of you." Amanda was almost in tears as she defended herself. "Why are you talking to me like that? By what right? The client wasn't well and cancelled the ride. And this poor man, I picked him up on the way back. What was I supposed to do? Leave him to die on the highway?" Enraged, Mr. Farris shouted even more. "You'll pay for saving that tramp out of your own pocket. I'll deduct the cost of the gasoline from your salary and take away your bonus, so others won't get similar ideas. Now get back to work. You're all out of control, doing whatever you want. And don't forget to clean the car. It's covered in dirt. How will decent people get in it now?" Amanda angrily washed the car, thinking to herself, "Well, that's how you get rewarded for doing good deeds. You're left with nothing. What a scoundrel Mr. Farris is. Nothing is sacred." Exhausted and sad, she finished her shift, went home, and fell asleep immediately after taking a shower. She had no energy left. The next morning, Amanda was awoken by a knocking on her door. She was surprised to find 3 well-dressed men, 2 of them bodyguards, standing outside. An unpleasant older man, clearly the big boss, entered without invitation and greeted her. "Good morning. Your name is Amanda, isn't it? You saved my son yesterday, picked him up on the road and sent him to the hospital. I'm truly grateful to you. Thank you for not letting a man die." Saying this, he placed a puffy envelope on the table. Amanda waved her hands in amazement, saying, "No need, I just felt sorry for him. The poor guy was badly beaten, barely able to walk, and was in rags. How did he end up in that wooded area?" The businessman seemed taken aback by the question, but still answered, "You understand, it's an unpleasant story. My son was kidnapped by bandits and held captive in a cabin in the woods. He managed to escape miraculously and tried to make his way home. Did he say anything to you on the way?" Amanda shook her head. "No, he didn't. He was in a lot of pain and only introduced himself as Mitchell. That's all." The man grinned and said, "Well, that's probably the best news today. All right, we gotta go. Take the money. Have a good day. Goodbye." The trio left, and Amanda ran to the window and gasped. There was a whole motorcade of jeeps outside. She counted 4 of them. The girl counted the money. There was a huge sum, by her standards. Clearly not a simple gratitude. She pondered. Her sleep was gone. No, something's wrong. First of all, this glossy big shot doesn't look like his father. Not a drop of worry, regret for the fate of his son. His eyes are cold and calculating. Close people don't act like that. Secondly, why did he ask so much if his son had spoken up? So there's something to hide. Thirdly, how did this man learn everything about me so quickly? And most importantly, why did he come to me? And perhaps this money is not gratitude at all, but payment for my silence. No, I must go to the hospital again and check on Mitchell. I should find out from him what happened to him. Luckily, today is my day off anyway. Amanda bought some goodies on the way and went to the trauma department, where she left Mitchell yesterday, but she was not allowed. "Why can't I visit my friend? I won't be long. I'll ask how he's doing, and that's all. Let me in for a little while, please." The doctor himself came down to her and strictly said, "Unfortunately, we can't let you in to see Mitchell Liebman. He suddenly fell into a coma and is now in the intensive care unit, and it is forbidden to enter there. You have nothing to do there, excuse me." The girl was shocked. "Come, yesterday he was weak and beaten, but he was walking on his own feet, and now all of a sudden he's in a coma? What's wrong with him?" The doctor waved her away angrily. "Why should I report to you? Who are you to him? His father's with him. He knows everything. They'll let you know when you can visit his son, but for now his condition is extremely serious. I don't have time to argue with you. I have other patients waiting for me. Have a wonderful day." Amanda was very upset and already began to leave the hospital, but then she was caught up by the post nurse. She took Amanda to some back room and began to whisper, "It's not as the doctor said. You're Mitchell's fiancé, aren't you? I guessed it right away. Well, there's something wrong here. He's not in some kind of coma. He's just being dosed with some powerful remedy, and it's unclear why and wherefore. But I noticed that respectable man, who seemed to be his father, gave our doctor a big envelope with money and asked him to make sure that Mitchell never left the hospital. Not at all. I treated his wounds yesterday. It was nothing serious. I think the doctor sold his soul to the devil because he is an avid gambler and he needs money. I know this because I have a cousin who suffers from this addiction. I have seen the doctor several times in the casino when I took my cousin out of there. I told you the truth, but don't give me away, okay? Or they'll fire me or destroy me. All right, I'm off." Amanda was in shock. She didn't know what to do. How to help Mitchell? She scolded herself. Well, I got involved in a story again. I have many problems myself, and I'm worried about other people's problems. What a stupid character I have. The girl was tormented with worries and doubts all night, not sleeping a wink, and by morning she decided for sure that she would not be able to live peacefully if she did not save Mitchell. After all, the guy was her age. Why should he die? It's not right. It's not fair. Amanda's first impulse was to run to the police and tell them everything she knew. But then she changed her mind. After all, if the rich man had so much money and connections to buy everyone and everything, then in the police he probably has his own people. And what could she charge him with? It's all just rumours so far, no proof. The worst part was that there was no one to consult, and then Amanda remembered that nurse, Deborah. So she decided to talk to her again, setting up a meeting at a cafe. Surprised, Deborah arrived on time. Amanda was the first to start. "I'm sorry to bother you again. It's just that I have no one else to turn to. I can't tell anybody about something like this. They won't believe it. So I beg you to help me to save Mitchell. I want to get him out of the hospital. I can get a car, I can drive, but how can I get him out? He's in a coma right now." Deborah paused for a moment, then replied, "Okay, let's think this through. I have the night shift the day after tomorrow. It'll be Saturday in the ward with a few people on duty. In addition, the Mitchell's doctor has Sunday off. I can refrain from giving that remedy, so the patient will wake up in about 12 to 16 hours. I'll provide you with a white coat, a cap, and a mask to ensure that no one recognizes you. We can also give you a name tag that states you're a doctor. We'll attempt to handle this on our own. I'm hesitant to involve anyone else because I don't fully trust anyone. The only thing left is to figure out what to say when they come looking for him, which will likely happen during my shift. I can't even imagine the trouble I'll be in. I could be fired for this. But you know what? Let them let go of me." Amanda let out a heavy sigh and responded, "I don't have a plan. I'll take him to my place, as there's nowhere else. Once he wakes up and tells us who kidnapped him and why, we'll go to the prosecutor's office and let them handle it all." They agreed on that plan. Amanda had been so nervous for the past days that she could barely focus during her work. And on the designated day, she trembled occasionally. She was terrified of what might go wrong. What if it didn't work? What if Mitchell didn't wake up at her house? But it was too late to retreat, and on the appointed night, Amanda turned off the camera after the last order and drove to the hospital. She changed her clothes as Deborah had told her to, crossed herself, exhaled, and went straight to the ICU. Deborah was already waiting for her in the ward. Together they placed Mitchell on a gurney and hurriedly took him towards the exit. The gurney rattled on the tiled floor of the deserted corridor, causing Amanda's heart to race. She silently prayed that no one would approach and question their actions. Thankfully, they were fortunate that everything went smoothly. At this late hour, all the patients were already asleep, including the doctor on duty. Once they placed Mitchell in the back seat of the car, Deborah quickly turned to her post, whispering a goodbye to Amanda. "Be careful, Amanda. I wish you and your fiancé a speedy recovery. I've packed the necessary medications and written down the instructions and diet on a sheet of paper. Now, I'm going to hurry before they find me." Amanda drove like a madwoman, her heart pounding. She felt like a criminal, constantly looking around and fearing that someone might be following her. When she reached her house, she called Barry, her neighbour, and whispered urgently into the receiver, "Barry, could you come out for a minute? I need your help. I apologise for being so late." The man was shocked when he saw the unconscious guy in the back seat. Amanda pleaded, "Help me. Don't just stand there. I can't lift him by myself. We need to get him to my room. Just don't ask me anything, okay? I'll explain everything later, I promise." Without hesitation, Barry helped carry Mitchell into the room and placed him on the sofa. He asked, "What are you doing, Amanda? Why did you bring him here? Did you also take the car from the taxi company? Mr. Farris will be furious. Did anyone see you?" Amanda shook her head, replying, "Nobody saw me. I turned off the camera. I'll turn it back on. You won't betray me, will you? I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm trying to save this man's life. Do you believe me?" Barry simply waved his hand and said, "I know you're a good person, and you wouldn't harm anyone. Of course I believe you, but please keep me out of your business. I have a family and 2 children. I won't tell anyone, but I don't want to know too much. I'm going home. I did what I could." Amanda returned the car to the taxi company without any issues. The guards treated her well, and she was confident that they wouldn't report her. However, she couldn't stop trembling from the events and emotions of this evening. The girl arrived home on the last bus, checked that Mitchell was breathing evenly, and collapsed beside him exhausted. She was worried and cried. "God, what have I gotten myself into? Barry is right. It's very dangerous. And if this rich man finds me, what will happen to me? What about Mitchell? I don't even have anyone to protect me. It's not life. It's a detective story. And I'm starring in it. How scary. But at least I saved a man. That's something to be happy about." 13 hours passed and Mitchell finally regained consciousness. He squinted from the sun and looked around, disoriented. "Excuse me, girl, where am I? Why am I not in the hospital? Oh, I seem to remember you. You're the cab driver who saved me on the highway. I never said thank you." Amanda grinned and replied, "I'll tell you such a story that you'll have to thank me again, though I'm taking a big risk, but still." The girl proceeded to tell Mitchell everything she knew about his alleged father, the drugs he had been given, and her own pregnancy. She needed to share it all with someone to free her soul. The young man listened attentively, not interrupting, and remained silent for a long time. Then he began to tell his own story. "Yes, he is not my father. But to make you understand, I'll start from my birth. It's a long and complicated story. My parents were very wealthy. My father was a businessman who owned a network of hotels in the city and region. My mother was a psychologist who helped famous people. So when I was 3 years old, my father faced my bandits, who threatened to kill him and the family if he didn't give the business to them. That's when my dad wrote his will, stating that all his property and money would belong to me when I turned 25. I think it was because of this that all the fuss broke out. I'm turning 25 in a month. My father had a close companion named Hank Long, who was also a distant relative. My father trusted him completely. After the threats, the criminals attacked my father and shot him in the car. Mum, from grief and stress, went sick. She had always had a weak heart and passed away soon after. I was left orphaned at the age of 3. Mr. Long, my father's companion, took me in and became my guardian. He is the one who visited you. Mr. Long took control of my father's business and always made me feel indebted to him for not sending me to an orphanage. He treated me indifferently, neither loving nor harming me. When I was 13, he married a young woman, and I became even more of a burden. I was sent to study at a prestigious private school in England, and then went on to university. Finally, I began to return home and start my own business. However, my stepfather wanted to continue controlling me. I accidentally discovered the existence of my father's will when I visited my former nanny. She had been with me during those difficult times and knew everything, but kept silent. Then I had a disagreement with my stepfather and started looking for the notary who had the will, and that's when everything went wrong. I began receiving threatening phone calls, telling me to leave town. I didn't pay much attention to them at first, but a week later I was kidnapped by some bandits. They kept me captive in an abandoned cabin in the forest, beating me and demanding to refute the will. Luckily, I managed to escape. The opportunity presented itself when one of the bandits left and I requested to go to the bathroom. Normally, they would take me out with 2 guys. We moved away from the cabin and I seized the moment to fight back. I don't remember exactly how I broke free and ran. I hid in a hole covered with leaves and stayed there for 24 hours. Eventually, I made it out and wandered aimlessly until I found the road, and that's where you found me. Now, I have no doubt who was behind my kidnapping and who benefited from abandoning me. Amanda splashed her hands. It's obvious, Mitchell. Of course, it's your stepfather. Who else? We must immediately go to the police, prosecutor's office, and sound the alarm. After all, he will not rest until he eliminates you. Mitchell evasively replied, That's right, I just don't understand why my stepfather didn't try to eliminate me before when I was still a child. After all, in the will, there is an addition that if I cannot inherit for some reason, Mr. Long will get everything. Amanda replied, So you are incredibly lucky, and your stepfather simply didn't know about the existence of the will and learned about it only from you recently. But I'm sure he had something to do with your abduction. I saw his eyes, cold, calculating and evil. Amanda took Mitchell to the prosecutor's office, where he told them all about his misfortunes, and then they went to the police. The wheel of justice spun, and a criminal case was opened. After a long and painstaking investigation, horrifying details from the past surfaced. It turned out that Mr. Long not only organised and paid for the kidnapping of Mitchell, but also had a hand in the murder of his father. Mitchell could not believe it. He was shaking. He asked the investigator to arrange a meeting with his stepfather. He wanted to look him in the eye and ask him just one question. Why? The guy thought that now his stepfather would repent and ask for forgiveness because he was facing a life sentence. But no, this scoundrel behaved brazenly and swaggered. Well, Mitchell, are you happy now? Yes, I'm getting old. I'm getting sentimental. I was weak, and they didn't kill you at once there in the forest. I was dragging you along. You were like a son to me. The guy choked with such insolence. A son, you say? How can you say such a thing? You've been telling me since childhood that you would find my father's killers, that you were grieving for them, that you were grateful to him. But you gave the order to eliminate him with your own hands. Because of you. My mum died soon after. You ruined my life. Why didn't you eliminate me before? Why did you pay for me to stay in a private school for so many years? You never loved me, I know. You just tolerated me. The businessman grinned wickedly. I felt sorry for you, at first, so I sent you away to study. In addition, I had an impeccable reputation in high society because I took to educate the son of my late partner. It kept suspicion away from me, and I was respected by everyone. And now you've come back to spoil my plans. It was only when you blabbed about the will recently that I got my head in my hands. I couldn't let you get everything. Too regal a gift. I've spent all these years developing the business, investing my time and energy, and now it's all going to go to you. No way. I thought of everything. I calculated everything. But you managed to escape from the forest cabin while I was still hesitating whether to get rid of you now or later. And I would have succeeded if it hadn't been for that stupid cab driver. First she picked you up on the road, and then she drove you out of the hospital. I hate her. That viper ruined my whole plan. Mitchell was outraged. Don't you dare insult Amanda. She's the best girl in the world. She saved my life twice, from you, by the way, Daddy. Well, you'll never get away with it now. You'll pay for everything. Mr. Long pitched forward and hissed angrily. You are very wrong, puppy. I have such connections, such opportunities. that I'll be free again very soon. You'll see. But the court decided everything justly, and the businessman, murderer, received a harsh punishment. Now, instead of a luxurious happy life, a prison cell awaited him for the rest of his life. He shouted in court how much he hated Amanda, blamed her for everything. After all, it was she who prevented him from becoming even richer and more successful, and saved his unloved stepson. Mitchell stood at the helm of the company and plunged headlong into work. He and Amanda often saw each other, were friends and socialized. In fact, the guy was secretly in love with the girl. He had never met anyone like her before. He admired everything about this laughing, snub-nosed, mischievous young woman, her cheerful laugh, her floppy ears and beautiful wheaten curls, and her kind, affectionate eyes. However, he couldn't confess his feelings because she was pregnant with another man's child and preparing for childbirth. He believed that if he confessed now, he would insult her and destroy their warm, trusting relationship. So Mitchell chose to take care of her and support her instead. He insisted that Amanda move out of her tiny old housing, and he rented a cozy apartment for her. He also urged her to stop working as a taxi driver, since her growing belly made it impossible to hide the pregnancy, and her employer, Mr. Farris, wouldn't pay her maternity leave and might even terminate her retroactively. Mitchell provided financial assistance to Amanda and made sure she had everything she needed. The girl felt very uncomfortable with the level of care. "Mitchell, you spoil me so much. No one has ever cared for me like this. Thank you so much. It's a pity I had to quit driving a cab. I really enjoyed that job. Sitting in four walls is boring." Quietly, Mitchell replied while looking into her eyes. "Amanda, this is the least I can do for you. You are not a stranger to me now. In fact, you are the closest person to me. Don't worry, soon you'll give birth to a baby boy, and there won't be a dull moment. I'll be there to pick you up from the hospital. Will you take me as the godfather?" Amanda was moved to tears and replied softly, "Of course. What are you even asking? You know, Mitchell, I feel so comfortable and calm with you, more than with anyone else. Why didn't we meet earlier? It's a pity. Nothing can change that." Amanda's heart was also filled with love for Mitchell. She was drawn to him like a magnet, but she didn't dare to entertain such thoughts. She kept reminding herself, "Don't dream about him. Why would he want someone else's child? Don't ruin his life. But then, why does he care about me so much? Not every husband would do that. Is it just out of gratitude? I have to convince myself that he's just a friend. That's all. There can never be anything more between us." Amanda exhausted herself with worries and doubts, and there was no one she could talk to about it. One day, while walking from the women's clinic, she ran into Deborah, the nurse who had helped her save Mitchell. Both women were delighted to see each other and decided to have lunch at a cafe and talk about everything. "Oh dear, pregnancy suits you," Deborah said with a laugh. "You look so much better, positively glowing. Well, tell me, how did your detective story with the kidnapping end? I've thought of you often. I almost got fired and was scolded for a long time. I had to write an explanation letter, and they revoked my bonus, but it was worth it. You should have seen the doctor's face when he couldn't find his paid patient in the morning. Oh, what an uproar. Eventually, the investigation started, and our corrupt doctor was finally removed from his position. He was scared and tried to dodge, hoping everyone would keep silent about his dark deeds. But many people were tired of his actions. He also got sentenced and is now in jail. He deserves it. And I even got promoted to head nurse. That's right. So, I have to thank you." Amanda smiled and said, "Congratulations, you deserve it. I've thought of you often too. Sometimes you just want to talk to someone, knowing that they will understand and listen without judgment. As for my pregnancy, it's a complicated story." Amanda told Deborah everything about her ex-boyfriend. Deborah only shook her head and wondered. You're really something, my friend. I admire you, to be honest. You're so brave. Decided to take a risk for the sake of strangers, and even being pregnant. It's worth a lot. Your Mitchell should kiss your feet. And take my advice. Don't gnaw yourself, don't torment in vain, and just trust your heart and fate. Everything will be as it should be, believe me. Give birth to a baby, love him, grow. It is the greatest happiness. If Mitchell really loves you, sooner or later he will reveal this, and the child is not a hindrance. I was foolish in my youth. I had a fight with my fiancé, and I terminated my pregnancy quickly without thinking. I took a sin on my soul. And now I'm 37, and I have neither children nor a husband. Do you know how many times I've regretted what I did? I could have raised a baby and not felt lonely. That's right, you're a good fighter. Way to go. Amanda took Deborah's hand and said, Deborah, thank you for all you have done for me. Please visit me from time to time. I'd be pleased to. Honestly, I've never had any real friends and I trust you. I feel you're a good person. So, let's be friends? Deborah rejoiced. I'm all for it. I have Sunday off. If you like, let's go for a walk. Let's look for some interesting baby things, fashionable strollers, and we'll have a chat. From that day on, Amanda and Deborah became thick as thieves. The women had a lot to talk about. They were somehow close to each other internally, just like sisters. When Amanda had contractions in the middle of the night, she did not hesitate to call her. Deborah, I apologize for calling at night. I think it started. My belly hurts so much. Then squeeze. Then let go. No strength. I'm so scared. What should I do? Deborah woke up immediately and started giving her commands. First of all, calm down. I will now organize you a transport. And you get dressed, get ready, and wait for me. I'll be right back. Do not forget the most important things and documents. And remember, everything's going to be okay. Dr. Brewster is a great obstetrician, and she is on shift today, and I'll be there for you. Then Deborah called Mitchell herself. Wake up, Romeo. Your Juliet is giving birth. Let's go to help. Already in 30 minutes, Amanda was taken to the labour room. Deborah and Mitchell stayed waiting in the corridor. The man was very nervous, paced back and forth, and all inquired, Deborah, you are a medical professional. Tell me, Amanda will be all right. Why hasn't she given birth yet? Maybe something went wrong. The nurse started to cheer him up. Pour some coffee from the machine and calm down. You men are so fast that this process can even last for 24 hours. Better admit, do you love her? Mitchell was embarrassed, but answered honestly, very much, more than life, and I don't know what to do about it. Deborah laughed. No, you're hilarious. What is there to think? If you love, get married and raise the boy with her. You both are so funny. Suffer in the corners and pretend that you are just friends. Mitchell got excited. And you think she loves me too? Honestly? I'm afraid to tell her. I think I might offend her. I can't sleep or eat. She's always in my head. Deborah confirmed. Yes, she does, believe me. Be more decisive, Mitchell. We girls are romantic natures. We always expect the first step from a man. Finally, a nurse came out and announced, Well, Daddy, congratulations. You've got a big boy. Amanda barely gave birth to him, thank God, all without complications. Deborah winked to Mitchell. Well, I told you everything will be fine. Go get some sleep, you lucky boy, and I'll try, as a medical professional, to check on my friend. I'm allowed to. Amanda smiled blissfully as she held her baby close to her chest. All the pain and agony she had endured during the hours of labour seemed insignificant now. As she looked at her son, the name Mark came to her mind effortlessly. It didn't matter who the father was. What mattered was that he was her own flesh and blood. Her life was forever changed, no longer belonging to just herself. The door opened and Deborah entered the room, quietly approaching her friend. She kissed Amanda and exclaimed, Congratulations, Amanda. Who do we have here? Look how serious he is, frowning like an old man. Come on, smile." Amanda laughed and replied, "Well, to be honest, it wasn't easy. The doctors were concerned that I couldn't do it on my own. But Mark and I pushed through, and now here he is, my little miracle. Where's Mitchell? Did he go home?" Deborah chuckled and said, "I doubt he left. You should have seen how worried he was about you. He paced like a caged tiger, bombarding me with questions. He loves you, Amanda, that's for sure. I think he'll propose to you soon. Will I be your maid of honour?" Amanda's heart skipped a beat, and she exclaimed, "You think so? I'm so grateful that both of you are here, that you both appeared in my life. I was pregnant and alone, with only my neighbour's support." Deborah smiled and said, "I'll be happy to babysit the little serious baby. I know he will grow fond of me." On a discharging day, Mitchell arrived dressed in an expensive suit with a bouquet of flowers. Deborah had been with Amanda all morning, helping her get ready, curling her with a curling iron and teasing her. "Your Romeo is downstairs, waiting impatiently." Confused, Amanda asked, "Deborah, what is all this? It feels like we're getting ready for a party. I'm just being discharged. Why all the expensive outfits?" The nurse chuckled and replied, Who knows? One thing I can tell you is that you're in for a surprise." As Amanda stepped outside, Mitchell rushed to her, while Deborah took little Mark in her arms. Mitchell took out from his pocket a beautiful box and opened it. "Dear Amanda, I congratulate you on the birth of your son. I want to put this ring on your finger as a symbol that we are more than friends now. I love you, darling, and I want you to become my wife. Will you marry me?" The nurses applauded, and the sound of a champagne bottle being opened filled the air. Even the elderly janitor paused his work to witness the scene. Overwhelmed with emotions, Amanda sobbed and whispered, "I agree. I love you too, and I can't help it." Deborah clapped her hands and shouted, "Cheers!" as she raised a glass of champagne. She was genuinely happy that two loving hearts were finally united. Amanda moved into Mitchell's mansion, and the couple officially tied the knot. Mitchell adopted Mark, giving him his surname. 3 years passed. Amanda and Mitchell lived harmoniously. Amanda deeply appreciated her husband's loyalty, devotion, generosity, and care, and she never regretted marrying Mitchell. One February, amidst the cold frosts and snowstorms, Mitchell suddenly suggested, "Darling, why don't we go to a warm sea, to a resort? What's stopping us? We'll warm ourselves in the sun. What do you think?" Amanda squealed with joy. "Of course I'm for it. I've never been abroad, but I'd love to. You're the best. Mark, we're going to the sea. Are you happy?" Mark clapped his hands, and the packing started. The couple visited a travel agency to select a suitable tour. The receptionist, a friendly girl, greeted them warmly, offered them coffee, and tried to assist them. She said, "We're delighted that you've chosen our agency. Our manager, Stephen, will assist you." 5 minutes later, Mitchell and Amanda sat down in comfortable chairs, and Amanda was holding Mark in her arms, while they waited for the manager. When the manager approached them, Amanda greeted him but didn't immediately recognize why he seemed familiar. Upon closer inspection, she realized that it was her ex-boyfriend, Stephen. It turned out that he hadn't made any career advancements over the years and remained a manager, just as he was before. Amanda quickly remembered their breakup and decided to play along by pretending not to remember him. She coolly said, "My husband, son, and I would like to choose a family tour to the sea. What options do you have to offer?" But Stephen was visibly flustered and unable to provide a proper response. His mind was consumed with thoughts like, "Is that gorgeous woman really that plain waitress, Amanda? It can't be. Her husband must be wealthy, and the baby is so adorable. He even resembles me. Wait, she was pregnant when I left her. What if he's my son?" Lost in his thoughts, Stephen barely heard Mitchell's voice saying, "Hey, man, are you even listening to me? I've been telling you for an hour when we want to go, and you're just mumbling to yourself. Maybe we should try another agency instead. I'm dissatisfied with this type of service." However, Stephen acted as if he hadn't heard and exhaled before deciding. "Amanda, don't you recognize me? It's me, Stephen. Tell me, is this my son? What's his name?" Mitchell raised an eyebrow and answered stiffly, "This is my son, Mark Liebman. Any more questions? You're obviously out of your mind. Amanda, let's get out of here. We've wasted our time. He's crazy." Amanda calmly replied, "Don't get excited, my love. The man has made a mistake." Mitchell took his wife by the elbow and his son by the hand, and they left the agency. Stephen got a big shock, losing such clients and such a woman. After all, Peggy had left him a long time ago. He never made a career, and he still lived with his parents. The only entertainment for him was beer and soccer on weekends. That was how life went on. Today, seeing Amanda so radiant and happy, he suddenly felt offended and angry with himself. Now his son called another man daddy and loved him, not Stephen. And what was he left with? There were few people willing to marry a simple manager without a place to live and any prospects. Only Amanda had loved him so sincerely and devotedly. If only he could turn back time, he would never have let her go. But it was too late for that. Amanda and Mitchell went on vacation, enjoying the sun and water, coming back completely happy and satisfied. And a month later, they received another surprise. Amanda found out that she was pregnant. Mitchell hugged and kissed her, spinning around and rejoicing like a child. And Amanda thought to herself, if someone had told me that I would meet a tramp on the road, marry him, and have his child, I wouldn't have believed it. And now I'm the happiest I've ever been. That's fate. Soon Amanda decided to play matchmaker for her best friend and introduced her to Mitchell's friend and partner, Andrew. It turned out to be a great decision. They had a passionate romance, and soon Deborah also became pregnant. Now Mitchell and Amanda joyfully shouted, "Cheers!" at their best friend's wedding, wishing them only happiness. The two couples often gathered for joint vacations, grilling kebabs, playing board games, and simply enjoying a friendly and fun time together. To be loved is more valuable than being rich, because being loved means being happy. Everyone knows this truth, but not everyone is fortunate enough to experience love and be loved in life. However, our heroes managed to achieve it. Jessica sat in her small apartment in an old apartment building, browsing through classified ads in a newspaper, searching for any kind of work. Her life had taken a drastic turn lately when her fiancé died. Carlos was also 26 years old, and he worked as a construction worker. The young couple planned to get married next month. Jessica grew up in an orphanage, so she has no one to help her. Carlos's parents were representatives of the working class and also couldn't help their son with the wedding. But nevertheless, the young couple were going to celebrate it properly. After the registry office, they planned to have a photo session and then go to a cafe where their guests would already be waiting for them. To cover all expenses, Carlos took on additional shifts at work. As for Jessica, in the last 6 months, she had not officially worked anywhere. Her fiancé insisted that she focus solely on housekeeping, and the girl agreed. "After all, I am a man," Carlos said firmly, "so I should also be the breadwinner in our family. And by the way, Diego Miera promised to promote me next month. I'll finish this project and then maybe I'll rise to the position of foreman. Then, Jessica, our lives will be entirely different." "What are you talking about, Carlos?" Jessica replied. "You know perfectly well that I don't need a lot. I'm already happy just because we're together." The couple had been living together for almost a year, and during that time, they had never quarrelled and agreed on everything. But Carlos wanted more from life, and Jessica, being a wise girl, supported her future husband and did not interfere with his endeavours. However, a month ago, Carlos died in an accident. The main crane broke down and fell on the residential trailer where Jessica's fiancé was located. Everything happened too quickly, and no one could have stopped the huge falling structure. When they called Jessica and told her that her fiancé had died, she fell into a terrible hysteria. She screamed, cried, howled and shouted. The pain that pierced her entire body, from the top of her head to the very tips of her toes, was so strong that she wanted to leave this world with Carlos. After her emotions subsided for a while, Jessica went straight to the construction site to figure out what had happened. However, to her surprise, the boss of her fiancé did not want to acknowledge his guilt. On the contrary, he treated the girl very rudely. "Why did you come here, dear?" he asked, brazenly staring her in the eye. "It's entirely your fault, and you are responsible for all the incidents," Jessica said, bewildered. "Carlos had already told me that you save on equipment. Half of your cranes are worn-out junk, but you still use them, risking the lives of other people. This is prosecutable." Diego Miera slowly rose from his armchair and looked menacingly at the bride of the deceased construction worker. "Ah," he said nasally, "so you need money from me then? I suppose you're counting on compensation for your Carlos, right? Here it is." The man made an obscene gesture in front of the girl's face and continued, "Here's your compensation. Got it? Who do you think you are? You think that if you threatened me with the police, I'd rush to organise a lavish funeral for your fiancé?" Jessica stood in front of him as if she had been spit upon. She had never been looked at with such contempt before. "How can you not be ashamed of yourself, Mr. Miera?" Jessica could only squeeze herself. Her voice was hoarse from tears. "Carlos spent days and nights on your damned construction site just to make sure that your facility was completed on time." "Stop, please! That nonsense! Get out of here! Blessed one! And remember, if you try to tell the cops anything about this case, you'll regret it. I have some connections." Diego Miera wagged his finger at Jessica, but she didn't see it anymore. The girl, barely holding back her tears, left the construction site, having noticed the remains of the crane under which her fiancé died. Returning home from the construction site that day, Jessica cried until the evening and then fell into a disturbing and shaky sleep. The money for the funeral was taken from the amount that she and Carlos had saved for their wedding, and she was also helped by Carlos's colleagues on the construction site. The men contributed as much as they could. The groom's parents wept bitterly as they saw their son's body being lowered into the cold ground. Jessica, who by that time had cried her eyes out, held on through the whole ceremony with all her might. But when it was time to go for the wake, the girl still couldn't stand it and burst into tears. A month passed after the funeral when Jessica had another shock. Feeling strange nausea in the morning, Jessica did a test just in case and was amazed when she saw 2 streaks. Jessica was shocked. It turned out that her beloved Carlos had given her one last gift before his death. Of course, termination was out of the question. Jessica wanted the child from her beloved man and was ready to do whatever it took to give the baby everything it needed. However, job prospects in her town were slim, and when potential employers found out she was pregnant, they always pointed her out the door. So Jessica, who until that moment had only worked as a sales assistant in a clothing store, had to look for other options. While looking through a free newspaper with ads, the girl came across a vacancy for a cleaner at a kindergarten. Despite her short-term prospects, Jessica took a chance to try her luck and get this job. Fortunately, luck was on her side. The kindergarten urgently needed a cleaner, and the director agreed to take Jessica without inquiring about her situation. So, there were grey workdays ahead. Jessica washed floors, swept and vacuumed spacious playrooms, and maintained order in the locker room and hall. The mother-to-be had work enough to do. None of the staff members bothered her, but they also didn't show her any sympathy. No matter what anyone says, being a cleaner now carries the stigma of being an outcast, so Jessica was treated at best with indifference. However, the girl never complained. She simply wanted to do her job as soon as possible and go home without talking to anyone. In the evenings when she returned to her shabby tiny apartment with a draft from every crevice, Jessica was exhausted. She tried not to listen to the screams of her alcoholic neighbours for the rest of the evening. This apartment was given to her right after she left the orphanage. The state allocated it to her, and it was where Jessica lived with Carlos until the tragedy happened to him. And one day, Jessica found in the locker room of the kindergarten a birth certificate that had been lost by someone. When Jessica opened the certificate, she saw the name Debbie Shannon. She had been working in the kindergarten for a month by then, so she knew most of the children by name. Debbie, a lovely red-haired girl, was kind and joyful, and always greeted Jessica when they met. Jessica put the certificate in her locker thinking, "Tomorrow I'll give it to the owner." The following day, Jessica waited for Debbie's stepmother to come and pick her up. Jessica could easily tell that it was a stepmother from her disdainful behaviour towards the child. The stepmother's name was Candice. She brought and took the girl from kindergarten every day, never forgetting to flaunt her new, indecently short dress or her mind-boggling makeup on her face. "Hello, I found that yesterday. It's yours," Jessica said, holding out the birth certificate to Candice. "Oh, thank you," said Candice, flashing her snow-white teeth. "Apparently it fell out of my purse when I was packing my daughter's things." Despite her kind words, the woman's smile was nothing like that of a caring mother. A second later, Candice took out a large bill from her purse and handed it to the cleaning lady. "Consider it my thanks for your vigilance and help," she said with a smile. "Oh, you owe me nothing. That's what anyone would do if they were me," Jessica replied shyly. "Oh, dear, don't argue with me. Take it," Candice insisted, thrusting the money into Jessica's pocket. "What a foolish thing to refuse money. Do you think I can't see that you need it now?" The young rich woman scrutinized the cleaning lady from head to toe, then suddenly suggested, "Listen, don't you want to work for me?" "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, not understanding. "I have an offer for you," Candice explained. "My husband needs a caregiver. He lost his eyesight not so long ago. Partially though, but still, he's as helpless as a kitten. He can't go down the stairs or take a walk outside." "I sympathize with you," Jessica responded. "He wants to have an operation. He's distressed sick," Candice continued. "Doctors say that there's a chance he'll completely see again, but I'm not sure. I'll pay you a good salary if you can take care of him properly. Well, do you agree?" Jessica thought that, on the one hand, she didn't really want to be under the same roof as this arrogant rich woman, but on the other hand, she would have a real opportunity to earn a large sum of money, which she needed for the baby. "I should try. It's not every day that I get a chance like this," she thought, and she agreed. "Well done," Candice smiled broadly. "I'll send a car for you tomorrow morning. Pack your things. You'll be living at our house." Jessica was afraid to quit kindergarten at once. Who knew how it would work out in the house of the rich? Maybe she wouldn't suit them. Therefore, Jessica took a couple of weeks' vacation from work at her own expense and hurried home to get ready for the move. When Jessica arrived at Candice's mansion, She involuntarily gasped with admiration. The huge 3-story building looked more like a fairy tale castle than an ordinary house. "Will you be my new nanny?" Debbie asked curiously. "Not exactly, dear. Rather, I will help your father while he is ill," Jessica answered, smiling at the girl. Paul Shannon, Debbie's father, turned out to be a pleasant man who looked a little over 35 years old. His bright red hair stood out against the background of Candace's unnaturally bleached hair. "It's clear at once why his daughter is such a redhead," Jessica thought to herself, looking at the owner of the house. The businessman wore special dark glasses to conceal his vision problems. He sat in the sitting room in an armchair, holding a long, thin cane for the blind to help him get around. He waited patiently for his new caregiver to be brought to him. "Candace, read me a book, please." Debbie jumped up to her stepmother, but the beautiful blonde rudely waved the girl away. "Can't you see I'm busy? Look at the pictures or read it yourself. I don't have time for you," she bellowed at her. Jessica pressed her lips. She was upset to see such a blatant attitude towards the girl. But what could she do? "Well, please, please," the girl asked, continuing to tug her stepmother's sleeve. "Why are you so annoying, huh?" Candace pulled her arm out. "You are wicked," Debbie shouted in her heart and ran to her room. "She's no good at all. A terribly capricious child," said Candace, adjusting her jacket. "Come with me. I'll introduce you to my husband, Paul." Jessica, who had only seen him from afar until now, was a little embarrassed when Candace led her to the chair and introduced her to her husband. "I'm overjoyed that you agreed to help me," Paul said, extending his broad palm to Jessica. "I hope it won't take long. The doctor said that the operation can be carried out in a couple of months." Candace grimaced when she heard this, as if she had eaten something sour. "Let's not think so far ahead, dear," she said in a sweet and luscious voice. "Now, the main thing is to make you feel confident again, moving around the house. That's why I've hired a nurse for you." "Then I think you won't mind if Jessica helps me up to my room," Paul answered calmly, and then put his hand in Jessica's. She obeyed silently. "I want you to know this mansion like the back of your hand, Jessica," said the businessman as the girl began to climb the stairs with him. "It depends on how soon I can get used to my present position. Who knows if Candace is right and this operation will not help me." Jessica looked at her ward with sympathy and shook her head negatively. "Don't think about it so negatively, Paul. Everything will definitely be fine, and you will be able to see your daughter and wife again. It can't be otherwise." The businessman stopped on the step, turned his head to Jessica, and said with some surprise, "Thank you, Jessica. You are very kind." For the last few years before he went blind, Paul went to the same place every day, to the cemetery where Susan, his first wife, and Debbie's mother was buried. "Susan," he often said, looking at the portrait of his late wife, "I promise that I will never forget about you. Forgive me, my love." The businessman wiped away unsolicited tears from his face, which every time came to his eyes when he remembered his Susan. Not a day passed that Paul did not blame himself for what happened to his wife. It seemed to him that if he had been more attentive and caring, Susan's death could have been avoided. Paul and Susan had long dreamed of having a child, but since their marriage, Susan had not been able to conceive. Finally, after almost 4 years, Susan managed to get pregnant. After learning about it, the businessman was ready to carry her in his arms. When they were told that they were expecting a daughter, he immediately gave his wife a gorgeous necklace of natural pearls. "I want our girl to be as beautiful as these pearls." Paul said this with admiration, looking at his beloved wife. The pregnancy was going well, and the husband and wife, with increasing excitement, looked at the calendar, waiting for the day when Susan was to give birth. Close to that day, the young woman started having contractions, and Paul immediately took her to the hospital. Throughout the day, Paul was on edge, waiting for a call from the hospital. He called countless times but received no explanation. Unable to wait any longer, he rushed to the hospital. But on the way, he received a phone call from the duty nurse in the maternity ward. "Good evening, Mr. Shannon. This is the duty nurse of the maternity ward." "Hi, how is Susan? Is she all right? And my daughter, how is she?" impatiently asked the businessman. However, there was a heavy silence on the phone for a few seconds. "Why are you silent? Hello?" "Mr. Shannon, the thing is, you'd better come. Your wife, she's dead." Without looking at the road, Paul flew to the hospital, ignoring traffic lights in a desperate attempt to stop the passing of his infinitely beloved wife. Paul stood in the emergency room of the clinic and listened to the explanations of the surgeon who delivered Susan. "Your wife had a very narrow pelvis, so we had to perform a cesarean to deliver the baby," the doctor said. "But unexpectedly, there was heavy bleeding. Susan's blood coagulation was very low. I'm sorry, Mr. Shannon. We really did everything we could. Fortunately, your daughter turned out to be completely healthy. You will be able to pick her up in a few days. Please accept my sincere condolences." The surgeon said something else, but it did not matter to the businessman. Without listening to the doctor, he went out on stiff legs to the porch of the clinic, sat down on a bench, and gave vent to his grief. Tears rolled down his cheeks, and he was unable to stop them. How was it possible that his one and only Susan had died? They had been so looking forward to the birth of their daughter, believing that it would change their lives and fill them with new happiness. Other nurses and doctors, seeing the state of the inconsolable widower, tried not to disturb him. They bypassed the man, giving him the opportunity to mourn his beloved wife. 2 weeks later, the businessman took his tiny daughter from the maternity ward and left her in the care of his mother. Paul was then hit with depression, which knocked him out of his routine for a long time and prevented him from devoting enough time to his child. Thankfully, his mother was there for him and helped him cope with the grief and, in a new way, looking at the meaning of his own life. From then on, Paul lived solely for the sake of his daughter, only she in the business, which he immersed himself in with his head for the next 4 years, helped him partially cope with the pain of losing his beloved wife. His business was growing, gaining momentum, and he had less and less spare time for his daughter. Meanwhile, the girl needed a good upbringing. When Debbie turned 4 years old, Paul considered hiring a nanny. His mother was already too old and she had serious health problems. The man realized that it would be much better for Debbie to be brought up at home, in the family circle, rather than in a kindergarten among complete strangers. Turning to a recruitment agency, Paul faced another problem. As it turned out, there were so many applicants for the role of nanny that choosing the best one was still quite a task. After reviewing 24 women, the exhausted businessman chose a young and pretty Candice. She seemed sincere and wanted to be friends with his daughter, and Paul was impressed. From the very first days of her stay at the house, this spectacular beauty surrounded little Debbie with care and affection. The businessman was truly delighted with the nanny and grateful to her for treating his little girl as if she were her own. However, Paul did not even guess what was really on Candice's mind. Only his mother immediately suspected that the nanny was not who she pretended to be. In fact, in their first meeting, the experienced woman noticed a predatory glint in Candice's greenish-yellow eyes, like a snake. Candice appeared to be an angel when she was near Debbie, but as soon as she was alone with the businessman, her face changed instantly, revealing a very cunning and calculating person. "Mrs. Shannon, repeatedly saw how Candace looked at her son with frank interest and guessed that Candace intended to get close to him using her little granddaughter. "Paul, Sonny, you should take a closer look at this Candace. I don't like her," Mrs. Shannon advised. But Paul only smiled slightly in response and asked, "What's wrong? Debbie loves her, and she does her job well. What displeases you?" But the elderly, wise woman only shook her head reproachfully and warned, "She has a bad heart. Believe me, she wants to take Susan's place." "Come on, what nonsense." Paul laughed then. "Candace does not interest me at all in this regard." Not much time passed, and Paul, who at first really treated the nanny coldly and aloofly, gave up under the charm of the young beauty. The passion emanating from this blonde captured the businessman like a turbulent maelstrom. The affair that erupted between them, like fire, led to a quick wedding. Mrs. Shannon opposed their relationship and tried to reason with her son several times, but it was all in vain. Paul was bewitched by Candace and refused to listen to anyone. After having a lavish wedding, the newlyweds went to the sea for their honeymoon. When they returned, the former nanny made it clear to her mother-in-law that she was the real mistress of the house. "You should change your anger for mercy, mother. You cannot change anything. Paul is my husband now, and I am the mistress here. You better keep quiet if you do not want to spend the rest of your days in some remote home for the elderly. Believe me, I can arrange such a thing. Paul listens to me in everything." Mrs. Shannon was struck by the insolence of her daughter-in-law, but did not say anything. She realized that as long as her son was under the influence of this snake, it was pointless to tell him anything. Meanwhile, Candace became more and more enamored with the wealthy lifestyle and spent her husband's money without remorse on shopping, beauty salons, and expensive restaurants. The stepmother no longer interested her, and she persuaded her husband to send the girl to kindergarten. "Why is she always sitting at home?" Candace pouted her lips and asked Paul. "She's almost 5. It's time to get her into a normal environment. Kindergarten has excellent teachers and nannies, and the girl will quickly make new friends. And I'll have more spare time for you, honey," Candace said, wanting to get rid of the annoying stepdaughter. Meanwhile, the little girl did not understand why her kind nanny, who had married her father, suddenly became cold and angry. And soon her father listened to the convincing arguments of his second wife and agreed to send his daughter to kindergarten. Who knows, but maybe the anxiety associated with her son's new wife was the cause of it. After that, Candace breathed a sigh of relief and began to put things in order in the mansion. She tried to get rid of everything that reminded Paul of his past life. And a little later, the businessman himself was involved in a terrible accident while returning from another business trip. He was not at fault. A drunk driver drove straight into oncoming traffic and crashed into Paul's car. In a fatal accident, it was Paul who suffered the most. Due to a severe head injury, the man almost completely lost his eyesight. Doctors assured him that it was a temporary phenomenon, but it would only become clear after Paul had undergone surgery. The businessman himself doubted. He then believed that he would see again, then fell into despair. Candace, however, did not miss the opportunity to add fuel to the fire of his desperation. The young wife, all the time, hinted that her husband would be wearing the sunglasses for the rest of his life, and therefore it would be good to leave the business to her, just in case. Paul quickly realized that he had made a mistake in marrying the former nanny. Only now had he discovered what he had not noticed before because of Candace's beauty. By her voice and intonations, as well as by Candace's behavior, the man realized that she never loved him and married him solely for money. After a week of Jessica's work in a new house, Little Debbie completely loved the kind and sympathetic woman who was always ready to play with her or read a fairy tale to her before bedtime. Gradually, Jessica began to come to the conclusion that Paul and Candice were not in the best of relationships. Jessica helped the businessman with almost everything that concerned movement around the house and outside it, and she also looked after Paul in everyday life. She helped him choose this or that tie, sorted his clothes by colour, and so on. Meanwhile, for some strange reason, the voice of this sweet and genuinely kind girl seemed very familiar to Paul. On the other hand, aren't there many similar voices in life? In the end, the businessman stopped paying much attention to it, writing it all off to his own impressionability caused by blindness. Jessica noticed that Candice tried to destroy any memory of her husband's first wife. She burned all the photos of Susan and threw away or sold all her things and jewellery. The nurse thought it was the banal selfishness of a woman who wanted to be the sole owner of the mansion. Candice was so anxious to get rid of any memory of Susan that she almost immediately forgot what she looked like. Thankfully for such a shallow person as Candice was, it was easy. But most of all, Jessica was upset by the fact that Debbie's stepmother treated her badly. The little girl always left Candice's room in tears, and once Jessica even heard how Candice deliberately humiliated Debbie and scared her so that she would send the poor girl to a closed women's boarding school. No wonder this woman lost the girl's birth certificate, Jessica thought to herself. She wants to get rid of her. And then Jessica started to suspect that Candice had a lover. She often saw how she closed herself in the kitchen or bathroom and talked to someone on the phone, sounding at the same time as a March cat. However, Jessica realized that she had no right to interfere in other people's relationships. She was only a caregiver, and her business was to help her blind master. A little more time passed, and Paul was scheduled for an operation. Although Candice was against the fact that her husband, as she put it, was being exposed to unnecessary risk, the businessman still went to the operating table. Fortunately, everything went well, and for the next 2 weeks, the man walked with a special bandage, providing optimal healing of the tissues. When the bandage was removed and he arrived home, he involuntarily froze on the spot, seeing Jessica in front of him. "Susan," he could only whisper, almost fainting. "But how is that possible? You died 5 years ago." Jessica didn't understand anything and only had time to pick up the businessman, who had fallen to the floor in shock. "Paul, what's the matter with you?" she exclaimed in horror. "Hold on, I'll call an ambulance." "Jessica, it's all right," the businessman told her. "Just help me sit down and listen to me." After Paul was placed on the sofa, he looked at his nurse in amazement. It was hard for him to believe that all this time he was being looked after by an exact copy of his late wife. "No, it can't be," Jessica said upon learning about everything. "My mum died of complications from the flu when I was 3 years old. Then I was sent to an orphanage. I never had a sister, much less a twin." Paul was very puzzled, and Candice, in the meantime, was gnashing her teeth with rage. How could she not have noticed such a resemblance between this shy girl and Susan? Her memory had played a cruel trick on her. Paul, meanwhile, used all his connections and hired private investigators. They found out that many years ago, in the maternity hospital where Jessica and Susan's mother gave birth, there was a criminal scam. The midwife who delivered the mother of twin girls told her that one of her daughters had died immediately after birth. The midwife herself took the second girl and gave her to her friend, who had given birth on the same day and whose baby was born dead. The midwife's friend, of course, knew nothing about it. She brought up and raised the girl who later became Susan, Paul's first wife. Now, it turned out that Jessica, in addition to the businessman, looked after her own niece. She was surprised, but still thrilled to learn that Debbie was her niece. The only one who was not happy about the whole story was Candace. She planned to become the sole heiress of Paul's fortune, and here, in addition to his daughter, which Candace wanted to get rid of so much, she also popped up her own aunt. The former nanny was ready to do anything but stop her fool husband from dividing his huge fortune between his snotty daughter and a pregnant live-in caregiver. Candace realized that it was time for decisive action. It was necessary for Paul to take special medicines for complete recovery. So, Candace decided to substitute these capsules. In her opinion, this was the best way to get rid of her surly husband. The businessman had a severe allergy to nuts, so the wife poisoner decided to use this weakness against him. Jessica was right that Candace had a lover, and he had serious connections with the police. He was the one who advised Candace to add walnut oil to the capsules to get rid of Paul. Candace believed forensic experts would determine that the deceased ate nuts before his death, so it would be viewed as an accident, and her lover would make sure no one poked around in the case. Candace was discussing everything on the phone, as usual, locked in the bathroom. Unbeknownst to her, Jessica was standing on the other side of the door. She overheard almost the entire conversation and recorded it on her cell phone. Without wasting a minute, she rushed to Paul's office and informed him about the attempt on his life. Oh my goodness. Well done, Candace. You cleverly thought of everything, but it was quite expected, said Paul thoughtfully. However, we need evidence. That record isn't enough. We can install a hidden camera in your bedroom, Jessica proposed. We'll record how Candace adds oil to the medicine. She said she would do it with a syringe, using the thinnest needle. You won't even notice such a puncture, and after that she planned to burn the other capsules in the fireplace, so that no one could prove anything. The businessman, disappointed, shook his head. Of course, I realized that sooner or later we would have to divorce. We are not suitable for each other, but going that far, that's beyond the bounds. Paul agreed to Jessica's plan and installed several miniature cameras in their shared bedroom on the same day. He asked the guards to keep a close watch and record everything that would happen in the room. Everything turned out exactly as Jessica had predicted. As soon as Candace had pumped the capsules with oil, police sirens were wailing outside. When they arrived, they caught Candace red-handed and obtained recordings from video cameras that clearly captured the entire process. Paul, I beg you, you won't let these people put me in jail? Candace wailed. Yes, I made a mistake, but that's no reason to destroy our family, is it? We have a daughter, after all. What about our Debbie? Have you thought about her? Police bracelets snapped on the poisoner's wrists with a loud click. It's too late for you to remember my daughter, the businessman corrected her. You'll have plenty of time to think about what you were going to do. In jail. The policeman put Candace in the back seat of the official car. Paul never wanted to hear anything more about this woman. The most interesting thing turned out during the interrogation. Candace's lover was the same Diego Miera, Carlos's former boss. The thread led the investigators to a major fraud, not only on the construction site, but also in the biography of the villain. Diego had been speculating with the money received from insurance on their lives of his employees for many years. That is why, wherever he worked, there were invariably accidents that led to the deaths of employees or construction workers. Now he and Candace will face severe punishment and a long prison term. After the trial, Paul immediately divorced Candace and proposed to Jessica. He believed that she was sent to him by fate and his sweet Susan. As for Jessica herself, she had long had feelings for Paul, and she agreed to become not only his wife, but also the best mum in the world for Debbie. After just a couple of months, Jessica gave birth to a healthy and beautiful boy, whom she and Paul named Timothy. The rich man immediately gave the boy his last name and officially became his father. Now, the couple, Paul and Jessica, had 2 adorable kids. They celebrated a modest wedding at home in the circle of the closest people. Now they are happy. They remember with love their deceased loved ones and try to forget all the terrible people who showed up in their lives. There were 2 people standing in a small room with yellow floral wallpaper. One was Mrs. Pickles, a short woman with grey hair and hard facial features, including an eagle nose and thin lips. She wore a coarse, heavy necklace that bounced with every sharp and whip-smart word she uttered. "Frank, do you realise that we can't live like this anymore?" asked the woman, raising her head. "She's in our way." The man looked at his mother with a pinch of defiance and a sense of guilt. His soft facial features became pitiful, his hands flailed helplessly, and his eyes avoided his mother's gaze. "But Mum, Janice is my wife." The woman splayed her hands apart and snorted. "Oh, come on. You wouldn't have another woman if you cared for her. And I'm not going to clean up after her. She's like a vegetable. And you heard what the doctor said. She won't live more than a year, so what's the point of doing anything? I think she'll be fine at her grandmother's house. There she'll remember her homeland and her childhood. One good thing here is that you will have a decent inheritance when she dies. That could improve our situation. So..." Frank looked thoughtfully at his mother and sighed. The next day, all the bags and suitcases with Janice's belongings were ready. Mrs. Pickles put them out into the hallway, grinning at the sight of her confused daughter-in-law. Janice, a petite and pretty girl with blonde hair, sat in a wheelchair. At the age of 27, she was unexpectedly struck by a stroke, leaving her disabled. Janice not only lost the ability to move, but also to speak. She sat almost constantly in her wheelchair, remaining silent. When Frank was at his work, Mrs. Pickles took care of her daughter-in-law, and sometimes it seemed to Janice that her husband deliberately stayed late at work to avoid coming home to the helpless wife, who couldn't even go to the restroom by herself. It should be mentioned that Mrs. Pickles never really liked her daughter-in-law. Janice's ambitions and desire to achieve a lot bothered her. She believed that Janice should support her husband instead of spending her days on work-related matters. Janice worked as an assistant to the director at a large company, but ideally she wanted to have her own business, but she didn't have start capital yet. The stroke destroyed any sympathy Mrs. Pickles had for her daughter-in-law. If before she had simply annoyed the girl with her nagging, then after the incident she constantly shouted at her, did not tolerate Janice's mute requests, and often forgot about medicine or lunch. The only thing that pleased Mrs. Pickles were that Janice couldn't speak and didn't interfere with her rereading the plays she had once performed in the theatre. While Frank struggled to carry the heavy suitcases to the car, Janice sat against the door, staring in mute horror at what was happening. Her eyes were red, and she was on the verge of tears. "Don't worry," Mrs. Pickles grinned. "Your doctor said you have a weak heart, and the air in the village is good. Maybe you'll even live this year. Didn't you ever want to go back to your granny's house in the country?" A multitude of thoughts swarmed in Janice's mind, but she couldn't express any of them. If she could, she would shout at her mother-in-law, expressing everything she thought about that old grey-haired woman. "Frank, dear, what took you so long?" Mrs. Pickles asked her son, who struggled to catch his breath. It was clear that he had a hard time with the heavy bags. "The elevator broke down. I had to carry all the stuff from the 20th floor," Frank explained. Mrs. Pickles shook her head, looking reproachfully at her daughter-in-law. "And I told you we should hire movers," she said reproachfully. "Mom, you know very well we don't have the money for that." "Oh, Sonny, once I used to perform in theatres every day, filling entire halls, and your daddy used to come after lectures to watch me," the woman said dreamily. "Could I have ever imagined that I would have to change diapers?" Mrs. Pickles glanced at her daughter-in-law with disdain and fell silent. Suddenly the neighbour came out of the building. "Mrs. Pickles, good afternoon." The neighbour nodded. "Are you going somewhere?" Mrs. Pickles smiled broadly. "Hello, we're taking Janice to a boarding house for rehabilitation. The doctor said it should help." "It must be expensive, right?" said the neighbour, shaking her head. "Oh, yes, costly," sighed Mrs. Pickles. "But I can't leave my daughter-in-law without treatment. She's done so much for us." The neighbour said something else and went her way. The smile and the pitying expression disappeared from Mrs. Pickles' face. She turned to her son and frowned. "Let's hurry up before the whole entryway finds out about our plans. We should have done it early in the morning." Frank took the suitcase in his hands and snorted. "It's dog-one cold in the morning. It's fall now. Do you want me to freeze all my limbs off?" asked the man, and without waiting for an answer, walked towards the car, leaving his indignant mother behind. Frank was the only and favourite child in the family. Mrs. Pickles and her husband Michael had him at a late age. The professor of law at the university and the star of the drama theatre put aside their own lives and dedicated themselves to raising their son. The result of such overprotectiveness was a frail Frank who, at almost 40 years old, lived with his mother and worked at a low-paying job where he was bullied by his boss and disliked by his colleagues. 20 minutes later, Janice and all of her belongings were finally in the car. Frank put his wife and her folded wheelchair in the back seat. Tears were flowing from the woman's eyes. "Janice, calm down, please," the man whispered quietly, adjusting his belt. "A neighbour will look after you there. We'll pay her." "Out of your money, of course," Mrs. Pickles cut in. Frank shrugged his shoulders and nodded. "We're not very financially sound right now, as you realise, so yes, out of yours. You'll be better off there." Janice looked at her husband with unwavering eyes, trying to see even a shred of pity or unwillingness in his pale face. Unfortunately, there was none of that. The car pulled away from Frank and Janice's home exactly at noon. Mrs. Pickles waved goodbye and went home to reread her playbook, imagining herself on stage, being greeted by the applause of the admiring art connoisseurs. Frank sighed, speeding up. He tried not to look in the rearview mirror, where he could see his wife's puffy eyes. "Janice, you should understand me. I have no other choice." The man could have sworn that his wife raised her eyebrow mockingly. However, when he wiped his glasses, all he saw was his wife's grieving face. "My mum is trying to make things better for us. She's right. I can't look after you all the time. I have a job to do. She's not young anymore, so you'll be better off there. You'll have your own nurse. You'll go back to your grandmother's house, which you often remember fondly." So, Frank fell silent again, turning away from his wife's gaze. But he could feel it behind him. It seemed to burn through his thin jacket and press directly on his lungs, making him breathe faster. The journey to the village where Janice would have to live was long. The village was remote and almost abandoned. It had a couple of streets with a few houses, one store in the very centre, and an old medical office that had been closed for years due to lack of staff. The dark blue car passed on beside a small house with an overgrown garden and a dilapidated fence. The house itself was quite decent, at least from the outside. The garden was filled with century-old trees and thick grass that in some places was taller than the fence. In front of the window was an old bench, and someone was lying on it. While Frank pulled his wife out of the car and sorted out her wheelchair and belongings, Janice stared unblinkingly at the silhouette lying on the bench, next to her long-deceased grandmother's house. The woman squinted, but couldn't make out who it was. From the bench, muttering something, a woman rose and staggered toward the gate. Her face was wrinkled and sagging, her hair was tangled, and there was an old bruise under her eye. Paget was dressed in completely mismatched clothes, a yellow t-shirt, green shorts completely unsuitable for the weather, and pink, worn-out shoes with rhinestones. You're so early," said Paget, stammering. Frank frowned and turned to his wife. "This is your nurse, Janice. Let's get acquainted. Her name is Paget. She will take care of you now." In confirmation of his words, Paget nodded and staggered a little. Frank unloaded all the suitcases from the car and even carried them into the house. Then he slipped Paget a thin envelope. There obviously wasn't much in it, but judging by Paget's expression, it was enough for her. Then the man stood in front of his wife and sighed. "Janice, why are you so disgruntled? I'm sure you're smiling inside. This is your childhood home." The man looked around the overgrown property and the broken gate. "Fresh air, constant care. What else do you need to be happy?" Janice could think of a million things that would make her happy. However, as usual, she remained silent, glaring angrily at her husband. Each glare carried more thoughts than words could express. Frank understood this, and even had a small pang of conscience in his heart. But then his mother's words and the numbers at Janice's bank account came to his mind, and this silenced the pang and made him anticipate the taste of his wife's money. Frank got into the car and waved to his wife through the window. Paget moved closer to her ward and waved to him. "Don't worry, Frank. Everything will be fine." The man forced another strained smile and the car drove away, leaving Janice alone with an empty, overgrown house and an alcoholic woman who was supposed to take care of her. A year later.
"Frank, are you serious? You never once checked on your wife for—"
Mrs. Pickles glanced at the calendar and said with horror,
"A year? Are you a fool, Frank? How do you know if she died a long time ago or, even worse, got up from the wheelchair?"
Frank tore himself away from the television and looked tiredly at his mother. He had just come home from work and casually realized that he had never visited his wife. Mrs. Pickles was shocked and indignant. "Paget calls me every week. Everything is fine there. I give her money every quarter. Calm down, Mum." Mrs. Pickles snorted and walked over to the couch where her son lay. She snatched the remote and turned off the TV.
"When I talk to you, you must look only at me," she said loudly and a little dramatically. "Paget, who is she? The same drunk you left to look after your wife? Are you sure she's taking care of Janice and not drinking the money you give her? Maybe she hasn't gone to Janice's in a long time while you're lying here watching TV."
Frank rolled his eyes tiredly. "Do you want me to go see her tomorrow?"
"Fine. I'll spend my only day off travelling to a backwoods village to see my half-dead wife. Yes, Mum, you really care about me." With a loud snort, Mrs. Pickles threw the TV remote at her son and left the room, saying everything she thought about him. The next day, Frank packed a few things in the morning, took an envelope with money, and got into the car. He looked longingly at the clock, which showed only 7 o'clock in the morning. He could still sleep, but instead he had to go to that damn village. He considered his mother's fears in vain, but since childhood he was used to obeying her in everything and always.
It was a long journey. The radio was broken and the silence of the car made the morning even more unpleasant. Frank vaguely remembered the road to the house where Janice lived. He used to give the money to Paget in the city, where she would specially come by bus to receive the envelope. Frank had been to the village only 3 times, once when he dropped off his handicapped wife, the second when he had been looking for a carer there, and the third when he was dating with Janice and she had shown him the childhood house. Unexpectedly for Frank, he pulled away, his car next to an almost new fence. The grass in the garden had been cut, but it had grown back as if it had been done a couple of months ago. Frank frowned and got out of the car. Carefully, he opened the gate and called his wife and Paget. However, no one answered. Frank wanted to go into the house, but it was locked. He tried to jerk the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he took out his cell phone and called Paget, but received no answer. Upset, he rubbed his forehead and looked around. Now his mother's suspicions did not seem so useless to him. Despite knowing that Paget was not trustworthy, Frank still had some level of trust in her. Frank knew that her house was close to Janice's house, and leaving the car he walked down the street. In 5 minutes he found the right house. To his dismay, it looked even worse than his wife's house. As he stepped inside, a strong, unpleasant odour hit his nose, causing him to pinch it shut. Paget was sitting at a huge round table, drinking a yellow-coloured drink. Frank quickly took hold of the woman and led her outside. "Where's Janice?" Frank said angrily. "Who?" asked Paget brazenly and loudly with a slurred tongue. She seemed to stare in front of her and saw nothing. "Where's my wife, you alcoholic drunkard?" "Ah, Janice? She doesn't live far from here." "Show me," ordered Frank. They walked along an empty road for a while, with Frank growing more and more surprised by the house they were approaching. Compared to the rest of the buildings in the village, it was huge, with 3 floors, a balcony and a large garden. Multiple cars and farm equipment were visible in the backyard. Paget stopped not far from the wrought iron gates of the house and pointed straight ahead. "She lives there now." She nodded and walked away without saying anything else. Frank was shocked by what he saw, but he quickly pulled himself together and rang a small bell. A joyful voice rang out. "Elliot, why are you so early?" Frank was taken aback, frozen in place for a moment. He asked quietly, "Janice?" The voice on the other side fell silent before responding, "Frank? Come in." As the gate swung open, Frank was greeted by a vast garden and a stone path lined with an abundance of flowers. He carefully walked along the path and entered the house. On the steps stood a short, petite woman with blonde hair, dressed in a beige suit and shawl. She looked down at him, her face seemingly expressionless. "I had already thought you wouldn't show up," the woman grinned. "But come in now that you've come." Frank was speechless as he followed his wife through the house, which was tastefully furnished with pleasant colours, beautiful decorations, paintings, and clean carpets. Frank turned his gaze to his wife, who looked even more beautiful than before the stroke. Her white face was now adorned with a healthy blush, her scarlet lips had a gloss, and her eyes had a subtle tint of eyeliner. It was a simple beauty, but Frank had never seen anything like it before. Janice led him into a spacious room with sofas and armchairs. "Now, I'll make some tea and we can talk." She went to the kitchen to prepare the tea, leaving Frank alone in the room. He sat down on an armchair, unable to take his eyes off the beauty of the room. He even pinched himself to confirm that it was real. He couldn't believe that he had expected to see his sick wife in a wheelchair, but instead he was greeted by a beauty that he had never seen before in his life. A couple of minutes later, Janice returned with a large tray carrying several cups of tea. She handed one to her husband and took one for herself, carefully sitting across from him. "Didn't expect this?" she asked quietly. The man shook his head. "I also didn't expect my beloved husband to send me off to die for money. I thought—" "Keep your meaningless excuses to yourself," Janice interrupted him. "I know everything, darling. You're not excellent at hiding the truth. It's all about my inheritance. When I received the will from my grandmother in Germany, I was ecstatic, imagining the life we could have together. But then I discovered something that changed my mind. Do you remember my friend Christina? We used to work together at the company." Frank nodded. "She's the one who encouraged me to change my life." 1.5 years ago. Tall and statuesque, Christina was sitting in front of Janice at the cosy restaurant where their boss had sent them for a meeting that had already concluded. "Dinner's on the company, why not indulge?" Janice grinned, comfortably taking a seat. Then she opened her small purse, took out an envelope and handed it to her friend. "Take a look at this. Do you think it's really true?" Christina eagerly opened the envelope and read the letter. It was a letter from Germany. "Who is Annie Reuter?" "My grandmother," Janice answered. "My father's mother. She married a German when my father was about 6 or 7. And they went to live there. Then my dad came back here and met my mum. The last time I saw my grandmother was at my father's funeral. She suggested I go away with her." "And why didn't you say yes?" "I couldn't have left Frank," answered Janice. "He's got a mum here, a job, and I've never dreamed of going abroad." Christina looked at her colleague with incomprehension. "You're incorrigible, Janice. You missed a good chance for an interesting life in Germany because of an ordinary man." Janice rolled her eyes. She knew her friend's position on her husband very well and preferred not to listen to her. Christina had always been a very sharp-tongued person and therefore had a good career but few friends. They all scattered because of her straightforwardness. "Your Frank will be ready to sell his mother's mother for money. Do you know how much your grandmother left you?" "There was a letter enclosed," replied Janice. "She wrote that I was her last relative and that she would give part of the inheritance to her husband's children and part to me. Judging from the letter, there is a very respectable sum there, and also a share in an estate in Germany." "Do you have to go there to get it?" Christina asked. "There are instructions in the letter. I can accept the inheritance here. The notary will come here himself. I can imagine how pleased Frank will be. He has always dreamed of money, of his business and—" "You've been dreaming too," Christina interrupted her, waving her fork. "And unlike him, you have the skills and brain to lead the business." "Don't say that about Frank. He's a good man. He's just unlucky." Christina burst into laughter. "Yes, and most of all he's unlucky with his mother. Not a mother-in-law, but a true wretch. I still don't understand why you live with her when you could move out." Janice shrugged. "Mrs. Pickles can't live alone. She's not used to it. And it's not so hard for me to put up with her." Christina grudgingly snorted and sipped her wine. "I don't advise you to talk about the inheritance to your husband. They'll either send you to the grave for that money, or they'll start wooing you and taking every penny of it." Janice slapped her palm on the table and looked threateningly at her friend. "Frank and I love each other. Nothing like this is going to happen." "You have too bad an opinion of my family." "Really?" Christina grinned, but changed the topic. That same evening, Janice came home and shared the news of the inheritance with her family. Everyone was happy. Mrs. Pickles even opened a bottle of expensive wine, and Janice felt that Christina was really wrong. A few weeks later, she walked down the street, smiling at everything around her. Life at home had improved, with Mrs. Pickles no longer nagging her, and Frank spending more time with her. She decided to stop by a men's clothing store to buy a new tie as a gift for her husband. Janice glanced at the shop window, oblivious to her surroundings, until she turned her head and saw Frank. She was about to call out to him, but suddenly she noticed a girl walking towards him. Frank hugged and kissed her. Janice stumbled backwards and leaned on the shop window to steady herself. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Without creating a scene, Janice got home and went to bed early, contemplating what had happened. The next morning, she took the day off from work and went to a local detective agency. A short, thin man with glasses sat at a small table, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. Janice sat across from him and explained the situation. "I want to know everything. How they met, where they sleep, their actions, the places they date. I want to know everything." For a whole week, Janice was in a state of uncertainty. She didn't dare tell Christina the truth, not wanting to hear her say, "I've told you so." But she had to admit, Christina was right. It was as if Christina had always seen through Frank. Not wanting their relationship, she refused to be a maid of honour at Janice's wedding, which really offended the woman. Of course, they eventually made up, but Janice still carried the pain in her heart. Only now did she begin to understand her friend, who only wanted the best for her. A week later, Janice got a call from the detective, and soon she was sitting across from him. "You know, you're lucky that your husband's mistress is quite talkative," said the man, grinning. "I had to follow her around for almost a week, interviewing her friends, but I found out everything. Her name is Aisha Selick. She's 22 years old and a graduate of the Pedagogical College. She met your husband a few months ago, I believe at the coffee shop. Thank you for the information. What about any evidence like video or..." The detective, with a broad smile, reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a large antique tape recorder. Janice was genuinely surprised by what she saw. She hadn't seen such a machine since her childhood. It seemed they weren't made anymore. Twisting a knob, the man turned on a recording that was loud and occasionally crackled. "Frank!" a high-pitched female voice exclaimed. "This is for me? Oh my goodness, it's beautiful. It must be expensive, right?" "I wouldn't spare any money for you," Frank replied with satisfaction. "Once I start my own business, I will be able to shower you with all sorts of jewellery every day." "But when?" the girl interrogated. "You said you didn't have money for your business yet." There were no sounds, but Janice was ready to swear that Frank smiled broadly. "My wife does. She recently inherited from her grandmother. We'll use her money to start a business and make a fortune." "You'll leave her, won't you?" Aisha said in an angelic voice. "As soon as she ceases to be necessary for me, yes," Frank said loudly. And the recording went on and on. The man and the girl were saying something. However, Janice was no longer listening to them. She went into her own thoughts, sitting with a perfectly straight back and looking straight ahead. She remembered her acquaintance with her husband and how happy she was when he proposed to her. Janice was 11 years younger than Frank. They met when she was graduating from an economics university. He invited her to a cosy cafe, took her to the park under the stars, and bought tickets to the theatre and concerts. Mrs. Pickles seemed very sweet and kind at that time. Janice, who had recently lost her mother, fell in love with the intelligent family and was ready to marry the poor and shy Frank. Christina was against it, but Janice did not listen. She was absorbed in new feelings. Memories arose in the cheated wife's mind of how she and Frank chose his suit for the wedding, and how, after the celebration, they sorted out the gifts. At that time she was insanely happy, and she was sure that she would always be so happy. Although Frank was not glad about her dream of business and career, he was more like his mum, wanting a family and children. However, Janice was not ready for this. She wanted more. Now all the dreams and hopes of a mutual life collapsed in one moment. Frank, the same Frank who never raised his voice at his wife, was thinking about how he would open a business using her money and then leave her. It seemed so wild that the woman sat there looking at the wall for several minutes. The detective was silent. He had seen worse reactions. Once, a deranged wife had simply smashed his window in a fit of rage at her husband. He got up and went to get some water. Janice drank the water in one smooth motion, and then remembered the words of Christina, that Frank was ready to sell his own mother for money. She did not believe her then, but now it seemed true to her. In the clever head of the deceived wife, a plan began to ripen. A vicious grin appeared on her face, and the detective recoiled aside. He had never seen such an expression on her face. A few months later, Frank's dark blue car pulled away from the gnarled fence behind which disabled Janice had been left. As soon as the car was out of sight, Janice rose from her wheelchair. Paget's eyes went wide, looking at her ward, who just so happened to be getting up from her wheelchair after her stroke. "Paget, let's make a deal. I will pay you as much as my husband pays you, and you will not tell him what you saw." Paget nodded dazedly, unable to ask questions. "That's fine. We'll be great friends. Here's your first payment." Janice held out some bills. "You'll come back every month and I'll give you money. In return, you must keep informing my husband that my condition does not change and he does not need to come. Is that clear?" The woman nodded, snatched the bill, and without saying goodbye walked away, and Janice went into the house to change her clothes. Inside the old house, everything was dusty. The furniture was covered with cloth. There was garbage everywhere, and one window was broken, probably because the children had tried to climb in. Janice walked over to the old red sofa, threw off the fabric and sat down tiredly. A cloud of dust had formed around her. The woman took out her phone that Mrs. Pickles had miraculously failed to find and dialed the only number she could trust. "Come. Everything happened exactly as you said. I'm waiting." Pushing the phone aside, Janice lay down. Her head was swarming with thoughts. She thought about everything and nothing at the same time. An hour and a half later, when Janice had already cleaned the house a little, the door opened and Christina walked in. She was holding a small grocery bag. "Wine and take out to celebrate," grinned Christina. "Good thing you brought wine. I definitely wouldn't have gotten through the day without it. I still can't believe they left me here for dead. And they believed the hastily concocted diagnoses. That's really beyond of mind. They heard I didn't have long to live and they started rejoicing. Where were they to ponder the reality of the diagnosis named by Dr. Grimes?" Christina and Janice began to eat, pondering what they would do next. "I'll live here for a month or two until I figure out how to move on. I have zero plans for the future. For the first time in my life, I have no plans." "What are you going to do here?" Christina asked. "An old abandoned house, an overgrown garden, a remote village?" You and such a place are incompatible. If I throw myself headlong into the maelstrom now, I'll have a nervous breakdown, Janice explained. I'll live here, calm down a little. Besides, I haven't had a vacation in a long time. Christina shrugged her shoulders. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. From the first look, she disliked Frank, not knowing why. She'd been stupid to refuse to be a maid of honour at the wedding, and she'd joked about him being willing to sell his own mother. To her, Frank seemed like a spineless guy, incapable of doing anything but writing insurance at his insurance company. But he was able to leave his wife to die, and this seemed wild. Christina spent the night at a friend's house, and the next morning she went home. Janice quit her job, but Christina did not, because she had no inheritance from her rich grandmother. Janice started the new day with a cold shower to refresh her thought-filled head a little. 3 weeks of living in hell behind her. She gave her husband a test. She had hoped to see a little bit of care or love from him, but eventually all she got was hatred and the expectation of a quick death. This was the worst of all. So habitual life was over. She needed to cheer up. Taking the money out of her suitcase, which Christina brought to her, the woman went to the store. She vaguely remembered its location and decided to ask the villagers, because it was early morning and everyone was either at work or at home. Autumn brought a coolness to the air, especially in the mornings. Janice wrapped herself in an old coat she had found in the closet, trying to get comfortable. She managed to find the store without needing help from passers-by. It looked the same as it did 20 years ago. The sight of the familiar multicoloured sign and the cloudy window, displaying the counters and a saleswoman in a blue apron, made the girl grin. As soon as Janice entered the store, she was greeted by the familiar smell of fresh bread and perfume that the saleswoman Mrs. Tyler loved. Mrs. Tyler had started working there when Janice was just a child. "Mrs. Tyler, hello. Do you recognize me?" Janice asked. The woman hesitated. "Something seems familiar, but I can't remember." "I used to come here as a child," Janice explained. "Oh, Janice, how could I not recognize you?" Mrs. Tyler exclaimed, coming out from behind the counter. She hugged Janice and kissed her cheek. "You haven't been here for so long, and we haven't changed a thing." "I've noticed. Can you sell me some groceries?" Janice asked, looking around the counters. "I need bread, milk, butter and vegetable oil, pasta, rice and peas, cheese, sugar, salt." "Honey, go to Mr. Leonard for the milk. He does not live far from here. And this milk," Mrs. Tyler nodded at the counter. "Even a cat would be embarrassed to drink it. It has shelf life of 6 months. Where has it been kept for so long? Grows the tastiest tomatoes I've ever tasted. You should buy it too." Mrs. Tyler fell silent because a man burst into the store. He was dressed in dirty clothes and had a serious expression on his face. He pushed Janice away from the counter and loudly demanded, "Mrs. Tyler, give me 2 bottles of mineral water, and the courier should have left my order here. A box with medicine and pest repellent." "Elliot, can't you see I have a visitor right now?" Mrs. Tyler asked sternly. Elliot glanced at Janice and waved his hand dismissively. "She's a city girl. If she needs it so badly, let her buy it in the city. But I need everything urgently." "Elliot," Mrs. Tyler looked at him sternly. Janice raised her hand in a conciliatory gesture. "Let him go ahead, Mrs. Tyler. He seems to need it more." Mrs. Tyler grudgingly gave the man a glance and went off to fetch the box. "Couldn't it wait just a few minutes?" asked Janice meanwhile. The man was tall with black hair and had hands that showed signs of hard work. His gaze was stern. Janice hadn't seen men like him since she was a child. Despite his slightly unkempt appearance, Elliot was quite handsome and appeared to be in his 30s. but no older than 40. He looked at Janice, squinting.
"Are you that principled?"
the man asked gruffly. "I'm in no hurry to go anywhere, of course, but even in the city, people observe cues, and they are in a much bigger hurry than you." Janice grinned and turned away, feeling the piercing gaze of the man's brown eyes on her. Mrs. Tyler came out with a heavy box and held it out to Elliot. "Here you go. The mineral water is over there." She pointed to the far corner, where plastic packages of mineral water were indeed located. "You can pay later." Elliot nodded, grabbed 2 bottles of mineral water and left the store without saying goodbye. "Who was that?" Janice asked. Mrs. Tyler waved her hand and went to the shelf of cereals. "The farmer is local. His father left him a small house of some livestock about 8 years ago. He decided to take the farm seriously and built it all himself. He hired workers and is doing the best he can. He has big plans, but so far he's only planted, sells food to our store and neighbouring villages. He's not a bad man, but he's a bit rough. Nobody knows why." Janice picked up her bags of groceries and carried them home. They were heavy, and she barely made it, but the small refrigerator at home didn't look so poor now. Then the woman went to get vegetables and dairy products for the people Mrs. Tyler had recommended to her. Even though in the city the girl was used to buying everything in the supermarket, in the village it was a common thing to buy from local people. Mr. Leonard lived really close to the store. He had a large yard and 2 goats. In the house, Janice found an elderly man making a chair. The woman explained the situation to him and introduced herself. "Janice," the elderly man smiled through his thick grey beard. "I'm so happy to know that you're Rita's granddaughter. I only remember her daughter." "Yes, that's my mother," the woman nodded. "So, do you sell vegetables and milk?" About 20 minutes later, she came out of the elderly man with 3 huge bags that weighed twice as much as the previous bags. Apparently, Mr. Leonard decided to sell a month's supply of groceries in advance. Janice was uncomfortable to refuse, so she sacrificed her back, which barely bore the load. After walking only a dozen of steps, Janice stopped, putting the bags on the ground. Suddenly, a black car with a large body stopped not far from her. Hearing a familiar voice, the woman looked up and saw Elliot. Janice hesitated. She didn't want to go with a man who didn't know how to be polite, but she didn't want to carry huge bags either, so she had to swallow her pride once again. "Yeah, I don't mind." Elliot got out of the car and picked up the bags. "Serious shopping, huh?" he said with a smile. "Are you going to winter here?" "No, I just arrived to make compote, fry some bio-potatoes, and that's it," grinned the girl and picked up a smaller bag, helping to load it into the back. Elliot turned around and took the bag from her hands. Janice felt his warm touch and froze for a second, and Elliot set the bag and closed the back of the truck. "Show me the way. Where do you live?" "Sure, I'll show you," Janice said, settling into the passenger seat. "So you're coming to us from the city, right?" Elliot asked as he started the car. "Well, yes," Janice said thoughtfully. "And what attracted you here?" "I grew up here," Janice shrugged. "And now I had some problems at home, so I needed a place to be alone. I thought of my granny's house. I've always loved this village. It's quiet and peaceful, and there is nothing to interfere with thinking." "Yes, it is." Elliot was driving quickly, either because he was rushing or because it was his personal driving style. However, his fast pace wasn't limited to just driving. Whether in a store or on the street, he didn't slow down much, leading Janice to believe that it was a characteristic feature of his. Soon they drove up to Janice's house. The bags were unloaded and even carried into the house. Elliot walked through the waist-high grass, which had already begun to dry and rustled loudly underfoot. "Is there no one to cut it at all?" he asked. "Grandma did it herself almost until the day she died. She knew how to do everything, from cutting and sewing to mowing and caulking the roof. But I'm just a city slob, she replied. By the way, you're from the city, aren't you? Janice asked. Yes, the man replied, glancing at his watch. What time is it? I have to go now. I'm sorry, I forgot to ask your name. Janice, the woman introduced herself. That's a beautiful name. Nice to meet you, Janice. Nice to meet you too, Elliot. The woman smiled. Elliot drove off, leaving Janice alone. She watched the departing car for a long time, trying to understand where this new acquaintance would lead. The next morning started with a rumble and a strange rustling sound. Janice, tossing and turning, got up from her creaking bed and went to the window. Outside, in the middle of a thicket of grass, she saw Elliot with an old scythe. The grass was neatly laid in even rows as Elliot moved. It was obvious that he was sweating, despite the cool morning weather. Janice opened the window and called out to Elliot. He looked back, stopped scything, and took a deep breath, looking at the open window and the woman looking at him. Janice was wearing only a long linen dress that she had found in her closet and decided to use as a nightgown. She had no time yet to sort things out, so she wore what she found in her grandmother's closet. What are you doing? She asked, and Elliot raised his eyebrows, silently expressing his opinion of the silly question. I realize you're mowing, but why are you doing it in my yard? Do you want me to stop? Elliot asked, slightly sarcastically. Janice shook her head and closed the window, not wanting to continue the conversation any further. She also noticed the man's gaze, clearly assessing her. To avoid repeating such situations, the woman changed her clothes and went to the small kitchen. Janice decided to make pancakes. Of course, she never got up so early and didn't usually cook anything. Besides, the fast city rhythm accustomed her to skipping breakfast. But now she had to feed the unexpected assistant, who decided to come to her house early in the morning to work. When Elliot finished and it was clear from the sound of the scythe that he had stopped, the pancakes were already ready. The woman went out on the porch and called her unexpected assistant. Will you come in for breakfast? Elliot shrugged his shoulders, put aside his scythe and went into the house. He was all sweaty and tired. You can use the shower. Janice nodded toward the bathroom and went to the kitchen. Elliot washed his face and then came to the kitchen and sat down at the table. In front of him was a plate with pancakes and sour cream. Janice stood next to the table, folding her hands on her chest. How much do I owe you? Elliot raised his eyebrows in a question mark. Well, you didn't do it for free, did you? For food. The man grinned and took a bite of his pancake. Leaning back in his chair, he looked directly into the woman's eyes, as if trying to read something in them. Well, since you don't want to accept payment, I won't insist. Janice shrugged. I'm used to having to pay for any work. Haven't you heard of the word help in the city? Elliot asked. Janice snorted and laughed. You said yourself you were from the city. Mrs. Tyler told me you've lived here for 8 years. So you can't blame me. I'm not blaming you. It's just that city people are always surprised when they get help for nothing. I used to be like that too. By the way, why aren't you eating? Elliot asked. I don't eat breakfast. The woman waved it off. I always had to go to work early. I'm not used to it. I usually have a snack at work. So what kind of work did you do? Elliot asked, tilting his head and looking at the woman with interest. Assistant to the CEO of the company. Elliot whistled. Don't think I've been shoveling money. Only with a child's scoop. But I enjoyed it. I was learning how to run a business, and I had a dream. And then I had a stroke. The woman snorted. But I'll tell you that story later. Today I have to clean the house and the attic. Besides, I have a friend coming over tonight. A busy life, you know? Elliot smiled in response. I should get going too. The man finished his breakfast and left Janice's house. She watched him leave with a long look, trying to understand his motives. In the evening of the same day, Christina arrived again. She brought some things that Janice had asked for. Christina whistled when she saw the cleaned yard. She set the bags down and called out to her friend, who was scrubbing the muddy windows. "I need to replace the glass. Where do you think I can find a handyman?" Janice asked without saying hello. Christina grinned. "Ask the man who mowed your plot." "Ah, that. That was Elliot, the local farmer. He gave me a ride yesterday. I don't think he has time for glass." Janice waved it off. "Well, he's already got time for grass." Christina shrugged. "What farmer?" Janice stopped rubbing the glass and invited her friend into the house. "If it's not too much trouble, peel the potatoes. They're under the sink. I can't do anything anymore," Janice said tiredly, landing on a chair and wiping her forehead with the back of her palm. Christina took off her jacket and picked up the knife. "Now tell me more about this farmer," she said with an enigmatic smile. I didn't know him before. He came here 8 years ago. My grandmother died around that time. He takes care of the farm. He has different animals and vegetable gardens. What else can I say about him?" "Is he rich?" "Christina," Janice rebuked her. "Why?" Christina was indignant. "It's crucial nowadays. All right, but what is he like as a person to you?" Janice hesitated. "I don't even know. He's kind of controversial. First, he insulted me at the store, and then he decided that giving me a ride was a good idea. So, he also came this morning to mow the grass, even though I didn't ask him to, and then he refused to take money." "Maybe he likes you?" "Don't talk nonsense." Janice brushed it off. "He thinks I'm the town idiot." "Take a closer look at him. Maybe for once in your life you'll have a normal man. Who knows? He's a man." Janice rolled her eyes but said nothing in response. "How's work going?" "Oh, don't ask. Without you, our boss has gone completely off the rails. He's already changed his 3rd assistant. It turns out you've been doing more than he thought." Janice had been living in the village for a month. She had gotten used to the small house and quiet life. Rest had also become a part of her routine, and it irritated her terribly. All her life, the woman had worked. She grew up in a not-so-wealthy family and started working right after finishing her studies. She never took days off, for no particular reason, and always arrived at work on time. And now, for almost a month, she had been doing almost nothing. During the first week, Janice spent her time cleaning the house and bringing it to a livable condition. But then came the silence and tranquility. The woman started waking up late, reading books brought by Christina, visiting her elderly neighbours, and listening to the stories from their youth. In addition, Janice could not get rid of the thought that she was constantly meeting Elliot. The day Christina arrived, he heard the conversation about the glass and came to change it the next morning. Janice fed him with meat pie. Then he fixed the wicket. The girl again cooked him breakfast. It was like this several more times, and Janice was no longer surprised at the early rumbling outdoor and the presence of the man under the window. And Elliot habitually came into the house and sat down at the table. There were hardly any long and weighty conversations between them. He didn't give her flowers, didn't compliment her. He just was there for her. It seemed very strange. Janice wished with all her soul to understand his motives. "Confess, Elliot, you just come to eat at my place, right?" "I wouldn't say that." The man grinned, breaking away from the current faucet. Most of their conversations were exactly like this. Short, low-key, and usually humorous. There were rumours in the village, and some village women even came to Janice threatening her. "Elliot is mine. Do you understand?" menacingly pronounced the brunette with lush forms. "You think you came here from your city and you can grab our men? What a stupid you are!" The stranger angrily tore a leaf off the tree and threw it at a dumbfounded Janice standing on the porch. When Elliot next came, she told him about his admirer. "Were you frightened?" grinned the man, and there seemed to be a touch of seriousness in his words. "I ain't afraid of country broads. I was threatened by grown-up men when I worked in a big company. I once refused to sign a contract instead of my boss, and they almost nailed me right there. 5 grown men in suits, and I was alone. That's scary. Not a leaf thrown by some crazy groupie of the man who, for some reason I don't know, fixes everything that breaks in my house." Elliot smiled and returned to the soup without any words. One day, Janice was walking around the village. Elliot had not come to her for a long time, and she assumed that he was fed up. She went for a walk to unwind. Deep in her heart, she hoped that she would meet Elliot on the way. For some reason, she wanted to see him again. She was so used to his strange silence that she almost missed him. Janice approached Mrs. Tyler, who came out of the store, looking somewhere in the distance with concern. "Mrs. Tyler, something wrong?" "Yes. Elliot's farm is falling apart. There is some kind of trouble. Our men and women are all upset. They could be out of work. And where else can they find work in our village?" "Oh, trouble. Elliot has always barely kept afloat, twisted his way out as best he could, but here something has gone entirely wrong." Janice frowned and decided to visit Elliot. His farm was 2 kilometers from the village. It was a big, long building from which the mooing of cows could be heard. There were men in the backyard. Behind the farm were large vegetable fields. Now, in the middle of fall, they were empty. Janice asked a woman passing by where Elliot's office was and went there. His office was small, one could even say quite tiny. In the middle there was a table and a chair. In the corner a closet and a small window in the wall, through which penetrated the crumbs of light. Elliot himself stood in the middle of the office, bent over the papers. He was saying something with only his lips, counting on a calculator and making edits to the documents. Janice came closer and said, "Hello." The man turned around abruptly and let out a sigh. "Is something broken again?" he asked. "I'm sorry, it's not a good time." "No," Janice replied. "I heard you were in trouble, so I came to help. Is it something with the paperwork?" "It's okay, I can handle it," the man said harshly. She stepped closer and almost pushed Elliot away. Reaching for the papers, the man said loudly, "Go away, or I'll have to drag you out of here by force." Janice raised her eyes and took a closer look at the papers in Elliot's hands. With just a glance, she could see the huge sums and excessive spending, which were unnecessary for a place this small relative to the city. "Do you even have an accountant or a financial expert?" "I'm doing quite well on my own," Elliot repeated. "I can see how well you've been managing. A fabulous spending spree to nowhere. You urgently need a specialist." "And where am I going to get one?" Elliot asked glumly. Janice smiled broadly and pointed at herself. "I have a degree in economics. Plus I worked for several years at a company where the costs and revenues were much higher than yours." Elliot waved his hand and sat down tiredly on a chair, leaving Janice with the papers. Late in the afternoon, when it was already dark, Elliot and Janice left his office. The farm was empty. The workers had cleaned up and closed everything down. "Why do you need both cold rooms and milk delivery 3 times a day?" "One is enough. It will be taken away and the rest of the time it can be kept in the fridge. There's no point in driving cars and spending so much money on it. And many of the costs are like that. The budgeting is very inept." Elliot scratched the back of his head in confusion. "I was actually in the military. Accounting estimates are far from my expertise. My father always dreamed of having his own big farm and fields, but I decided to fulfill his dream, even if it's a bit late." Janice looked sympathetically at Elliot as they walked down the narrow path. It was cool outside, the wind was blowing, but she felt perfect, calm and quiet. "So, what's the story about the stroke?" Elliot suddenly asked. Janice flinched. At first she wanted to joke away, but then she remembered that she had promised to tell. Letting out a loud exhalation, she began her story. "That's when I came up with that plan." Janice remembered the conversation with the detective. "Christina helped me put it into action. She found a doctor who, for a fee, agreed to tell my husband that I was in intensive care because of a stroke and that I couldn't be visited. After 2 weeks, the doctor sadly informed my husband that it was impossible to help me and that I would soon die, and he was discharging me to live out my last days among my family. While I was supposedly in the hospital, my husband called only 2 times, and when I came home in a wheelchair, I was forgotten and unwanted. And then he came up with the idea of taking me here so I could die faster. But I just thought that if my husband sees me at death, then finally remember that he really loves me, will call his mistress, will start to take care of me, to do something to make me live as long as possible. But I was cruelly mistaken." Elliot took the woman's hand and squeezed it tightly. Janice looked at the palm that the man was clutching and nodded in gratitude for the support. "Why don't you go back to the city?" "At first I wanted to take it easy and wait it out for a while, but then I realized I didn't want to go back there. It's so fast-paced, always running around. Plus, it's another reminder of Frank and his mum." Elliot let go of her hand and quickened his pace. "Let's go. I'll show you something." They walked for a long time and Janice didn't know where they were headed. But when they arrived, she exclaimed in surprise. The man had led her to a huge, fancy house with a high fence. "This is the house of an acquaintance of mine. We served together. He recently died of cancer. Now they're selling it and I wish I could buy it back. But I don't have the money, you know. They're going to buy the house and tear it down to build some kind of sawmill or something. Do you realize that if you buy this house, there's no turning back? I don't want to go back to the city. I'm too impatient and fast for the country, but too slow for the city. It's a paradox. I can succeed here, and I can't succeed there." Janice fixed her gaze on the man's stern face, his hopeful eyes, tightly compressed lips, and the wrinkles on his forehead that appeared when he was deep in thought. A determined light flashed in Janice's eyes. She squeezed Elliot's hand, mirroring his earlier gesture, and smiled. "You're destined for success. I'll help you. Together, we'll bring the farm to life, just as your father dreamed. I promise." Elliot answered nothing, but hope was in his eyes, and he believed in the best. Elliot and Janice began working together, and she assisted him in improving the farm. They invested in new cattle and equipment, and soon profit began to appear not only on the paper. Elliot was overjoyed. As a token of gratitude, he frequently gave Janice flowers. The tradition of fixing up Janice's house was revived, with him visiting almost every morning and her preparing breakfast. It was a cherished ritual. A few weeks later, Christina visited Janice's house and brought the papers. "Are you sure?" Christina asked her friend. "More than sure," Janice replied, taking hold of the folder. "There's no turning back," Christina echoed Janice's words. "I know, and I'm willing to take the risk." Christina remained silent, choosing not to argue with her friend. After what they had been through, she was determined to support Janice in any endeavour. Clutching the documents to her chest, Janice made her way to the farm. Today, equipment was arriving, so she hurried as much as she could. Furthermore, she had exciting news to share. As usual, Janice found Elliot in his office, sitting at the table and engrossed in writing. Upon seeing her, he smiled and radiated happiness. "You're early," he said, pulling out a chair for Janice. The woman sat down at the table and put the papers down. "Read it." Elliot took the folder and began to slowly leaf through the papers. His eyes grew wider with each page. Janice watched his reaction with hidden fear and anticipation. Closing the folder, Elliot set it aside on the table and lowered his eyes to the woman. "What did you do?" he asked hoarsely. "Did you buy a house?" Janice nodded and got up from her chair. She stood directly in front of the man, looking straight into his eyes. "You didn't want it torn down. It was your friend's house, and I promised you it would work out." "But that's a lot of money," Elliot exhaled. "It's my money. I do whatever I want with it. Besides, I like the village, and—" Janice's train of thought was interrupted by a kiss. "Is that how you decided to get the house?" Janice grinned as Elliot pulled away. "Is that what you think of me?" he asked hoarsely. "No, I was kidding," the woman exhaled. "I bought this house for us. If you want us to be together. I think I'm in love." The man kissed the woman again. "Me too," he replied, hugging Janice gently. Hearing all this story, Frank couldn't believe it. His hands were resting on his knees and his eyes were staring straight ahead in bewilderment. "Are you telling me you made all this up to test me?" Janice looked at him sadly and sipped her tea. There was a knock on the door. Christina walked in wearing a tight blue dress. She looked directly at Frank and grinned. "Well, did you tell him everything? Too bad I couldn't see his face. I was a little late." "So you know everything?" Frank bellowed. Christina grinned. "That was my doctor, the one I paid for the diagnosis." "Did you really think Janice pulled all this off by herself? She loved you too much to do it, and you broke her heart, decided you could treat her like garbage." Frank pressed his lips together. "You don't understand anything. Janice, I love you. Janice!" Janice raised her eyebrows, grinning. "Doesn't Aisha suit you anymore? Or maybe she couldn't. You wait to open your own business and shower her with gifts?" Frank opened his mouth to object, but stopped himself, realizing that excuses were pointless. "But how dare you play such a trick on us with Mum?" Frank asked. "She was so upset when she found out you were sick." Christina and Janice exchanged looks and laughed. Mrs. Pickles ran ahead of everyone and joyfully shouted that her daughter-in-law was ill and would soon die. "She was even more interested in my inheritance than you." Frank surveyed the house, then smiled broadly. "So you bought and earned all of this while you were married to me?" Christina frowned, understanding what Frank was implying. She wanted to argue, but he spoke again. "And since you acquired all of this during our marriage, half of the property is mine, right?" Christina, being a lawyer, knew the law and how such situations usually ended. Janice stood up from her chair and glared angrily at her husband, wanting to say everything she thought about him. However, at that moment the door opened and Elliot walked in. "Hi, dear." Janice nodded and whispered something in the man's ear. The man turned towards Frank with a serious and furious expression. It seemed almost impossible to stop him as he loomed over Frank. Frank swallowed in fear and began to back away, looking for an escape route. "If you, idiot, decide to threaten Janice, I'll make your life a living hell," Elliot said rudely, grabbing Frank by the scruff of his neck and throwing him out of the room. Christina, Janice, and Elliot heard the front door slam. Frank was quickly moving away from the house. "Why did you let him in?" Elliot asked Janice, stepping closer to her and hugging her from behind. In front of Frank, she held herself back, not wanting to show weakness, but everyone in the room knew how much she had suffered from his betrayal. The woman stood there, head low, and fought back the urge to cry. "I should have told him everything," she uttered. "I should have seen the look on his face when he realized that my inheritance and I were out of his reach." "Did it make you feel better?" Christina asked. Janice nodded and wrapped herself more tightly in Elliot's strong and reliable embrace. "I'll file for divorce tomorrow." Despite Elliot's threats, Frank still decided to file for divorce and divide the property. The court notice arrived at the post office, and Elliot brought it along with the rest of the documents and grimly handed it to the woman. When Janice opened the envelopes and read the summons, her face turned pale. She didn't think Frank would actually sue to divide the property. However, she also didn't think he would abandon her to die. He was a very unpredictable man. "We need a good lawyer," said Elliot, picking up the notices. "Christina," Janice said. "She heads the legal department of the firm. She has a license to handle cases. I think she can help us." Elliot sat down next to the girl and said, "Listen, I looked into the bathroom after you yesterday, and I found a test in there. Are you pregnant?" Janice nodded and said, "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd mind, and—" A soft kiss interrupted the woman. She put her arms around Elliot and smiled broadly, asking, "So you don't mind?" The joyful smile and mischievous eyes of the man answered better than any words. He hugged his beloved tightly and pulled her against him, saying, "If that rascal suddenly decides to sue you for half of your property, I don't care. You and I won't be left with nothing. We'll have our house, farm, the baby and ourselves. We'll have each other." Janice closed her eyes and sighed deeply. When she opened them, Elliot saw the determined and unwavering look that had once frightened the detective. "If he goes to court to take from me what is mine by blood, he'll get out of there with nothing. I'll take not only mine, but everything he has. He'll be left with nothing." The trial took place very soon, as if the universe itself wanted to end this strange case quickly. Christina became Janice's lawyer, and Elliot supported the woman from the witness bench, along with many of the villagers. The judge listened to the statement of the plaintiff with boredom and asked him clarifying questions, to which he could not always provide answers. The plaintiff's witnesses included his mother, neighbours and friends, who all spoke negatively about Janice. Mrs. Pickles displayed all her dramatics. "I was so scared when she had her stroke. I didn't sleep for 3 nights, waiting for news from the hospital." Tears flowed from the woman's eyes as she wiped them with a white handkerchief and continued. "And when I saw Janice, I almost had a heart attack myself. She didn't move. She was almost inanimate. I had to take care of her while Frank was working. I cleaned her, fed her, and she wasn't sick. The worst thing I could ever experience had already happened to me. My son and I have been betrayed, deceived, and now they want to leave me with nothing." Mrs. Pickles gave another sob and sat back down on the bench. "Your Honour, you shouldn't take the word of the plaintiff and his witnesses at face value. To begin with, the defendant has evidence of the plaintiff's adultery. The recording is admitted into evidence." The recording of Aisha and Frank's conversation played in the courtroom. A detective then took the witness stand to talk about the plaintiff's love affairs. Lies! Mrs. Pickles jumped up from the bench, but sat back down after the judge's warning. She seemed deeply distressed by the slander. I would also like to point out that the defendant did not deceive the plaintiff with medical documentation. She only pretended to be ill to test him. No certificates were provided. The doctor merely mentioned the diagnosis to the plaintiff and his mother without verifying it. Additionally, the plaintiff claims that she took care of the sick defendant, continued Christina. However, I have a recording of a conversation between Mrs. Pickles and her son. Please play it. Yes, Sonny. Feed her? Oh, I was reading. I completely forgot. But it's all right. She'll be fine. Anyway, she won't lose weight. What's up? You found a nurse for her. Good. The main thing is that she doesn't cost much. And the fact that she drinks, it's no big deal. The doctor said Janice won't last long anyway. The conversation turned off and Christina continued. In addition, the plaintiff filed a petition for the division of the residential in the village, which had indeed been purchased by the defendant. However, the defendant has already terminated her marital relationship with the plaintiff. They were living separately, and besides, the money used to purchase the house was from her inheritance and was transferred from an account opened in her name by her grandmother. Therefore, the plaintiff cannot claim partition of this house. The remaining money in the defendant's account, as well as the share in the estate in Germany, are part of the inheritance, to which the plaintiff is also not entitled to claim. The judge grinned, almost imperceptibly, but Janice was ready to swear that she looked at Frank with a hint of joy. The plaintiff's claim was seeking an equal division of property between the former spouses. However, it is not only the defendant's property, but also the property of the plaintiff himself, namely a 3-room apartment, a BMW car, and money in the joint account of the plaintiff and the defendant. Objection! Frank's lawyer, a bald man with round glasses, jumped up from his seat. The apartment is the plaintiff's inheritance from his father. True, Christina nodded, but according to the law, if one spouse has made substantial changes to the property of the other spouse, it can be recognised as joint. And what substantial changes were made? The attorney asked. Now, on the screen, Your Honour, you will see pictures of the apartment before it was renovated. As you can see, it was in terrible condition. These pictures were taken exactly 1 year after the plaintiff and defendant were married, and here are pictures of the apartment after it was renovated, another 6 months later. How do you prove that this was done with the defendant's money? First, during the renovation period, the plaintiff was not working, and according to the bank statement, his personal account did not have the necessary amount of money. Additionally, we have the testimony of the foreman of the team that did the repairs. The contract was made on behalf of the defendant. The defence lawyers argued for a long time, calling witnesses, and tried to prove their point, but soon the judge left and returned with a big red file for sentencing. The court has ruled to grant the plaintiff's claim. 1/3 of the apartment goes to the defendant. The automobile goes to joint use, and 50% of the money from the plaintiff's account goes to the defendant. The judgment has been rendered and is not subject to appeal. The banging of the gavel resolved everything. Frank and his mother looked at Janice with anger and hatred, while she was being embraced by Elliot. Christina, smiling broadly, joined them. I told you we'd take everything from him, she said in a slightly strange and even possessed voice. It's rightfully yours, Elliot exhaled. Not his, but yours. Do you understand? Now you and I have everything we've ever dreamed of. The man smiled. It remains to have a child, and the happiness will be complete. said Christina, collecting papers. Well, Janice stretched out and looked at her belly. Christina smiled. You're certainly fast. Will you take me as godmother? Do we have a choice? Elliot asked. None. Janice smiled and hugged the two dearest people in her life again. Now she would definitely be fine.